Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Learning Salon. We are very excited to have another session, especially one with David Chalmers. Before Melanie introduces David, I just wanted to briefly remind everyone that the Learning Salon is a forum where we have been discussing for the past 2.5 years the contentions and bridges between biological and artificial learning. We are a very interdisciplinary community. We've had speakers and audience members from philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, AI, computer science, linguistics, social sciences. Sorry if I'm leaving out your discipline. And because of this, we have a number of ways that we manage this forum that I would like to reiterate for people who are joining us for the first time. So first, please remember to add your questions in the Ask a Question area below and then vote on each other's questions. We might invite you on screen to ask your question. So if you don't want to be invited, please just say, ask for me. And otherwise, we might ask you to join the screen to ask your question. If you have clarification questions or want to share some links, you can do it in the chat on the right side. The speaker will not see it during their talk, but other people might see it and respond. If you're a junior scientist or philosopher and you are not used to this discipline or this format, this is a good place to practice asking questions if it hasn't been easy for you, because the talk is short and there's a lot of time for questions. And because if you don't need to show your face, it's a little bit, the barrier is a little lower, the bar is a little lower, but make sure to ask questions that are fair, that are based on understanding. And again, we sometimes disagree with each other on screen here, and that's totally okay. What we do make sure is not to interrupt one another and allow the other person to sort of finish what they're saying. And secondly, to make sure that it's everything with regards, all of our attention is to being respectful. Disagreement is okay, disrespect is not. And if there is any disrespect in the chat or on screen, we will definitely notice and mention it and ask you to edit. Another thing is that if you are also from a different discipline, don't be afraid of asking a question. Put it in the chat area, but ask it in the spirit of curiosity, so that people know that the reason you're asking it is because you genuinely are asking to get some information. And if you have a more informed comment or question, do add your links or your references if you want to say something, which helps everybody else. Thanks to people who are already sharing links in the chat. Okay, with that, I think I covered everything. And Melanie, I'm going to hand it to you. I just also want to say, David, 18 years ago in Tehran, we were reading your collection of philosophy of mind papers. I had done my undergrad in computer science, and I had joined a group of philosophers in Tehran because I was so into this. It got so interesting to me that I did a master's degree in philosophy of science, and I also attended ASSC. I did eventually end up in neuroscience and computational neuroscience, but it was a very fond memory for me, that whole book and how it started into the exploration of the mind. So I will forever be grateful for you for everything that I know about philosophy of mind, or at least how it started. And I feel like reading that book got me a lot further in that field. Melanie, please take it away.
Yes, we're really excited to have Dave Chalmers here to talk to us about language models. I've known Dave for a ridiculously long time. We met in the 1980s when we were both students in Doug Hofstadter's group at Indiana University. And Dave had, I'm supposed to tell a humorous story, I think, but some of them are untellable. But Dave, one thing that I was struck by, Dave had just come off from being a Rhodes Scholar, I believe at Oxford. And to be a Rhodes Scholar, you have to be good at some kind of athletic activity, a sport. And it turned out that Dave's was a master of ultimate Frisbee, which he may have been one of the only Rhodes Scholars with that particular talent. I'm not sure. So anyway, it's wonderful to see Dave here. He's been an incredibly important voice in the philosophy of mind, in cognitive science, and AI for many years. He's now a university professor of philosophy and natural science at New York University, and also honorary professor at Australian National University. He originally comes from Australia, and will be an exciting guest here on the Learning Salon. Welcome, Dave.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Melanie, and it's such a great pleasure to be here on the Learning Salon, which is pretty much legendary by now, as far as I can tell. So, real privilege to be here. Actually, yeah, I'll be talking about language models and consciousness, really issues at the intersection of neural networks, AI, and consciousness. An intersection I've been interested in for a long time, at very least since those grad school days that Melanie was talking about. Let me share my screen. That's right. I think that's the one. Sharing okay? Okay, very good. Yeah, I thought I actually went back to my photo albums from those grad school days, see if I could find any nice photos. There's one of Melanie and me, circa 1990. Melanie was an advanced grad student when I joined the group, and I was totally terrified of her. You know, she knew everything. Still am a little bit, but so I'm looking forward to this.
You look like Andre Agassi.
Really? Okay. Interesting.
That's a great photo.
Alas, no more. Somebody said that you look like John Bellamy, John, in the
Bethany. Yeah, no, I'll take that. I'll take that.
Yeah, good. So yeah, back in those days, neural networks were actually going through one of their periods of excitement, and there was a lot of work on neural networks going on around Indiana, where Melanie and I both were. I dug up a few scraps. There's a material here from a talk I gave at NeurIPS, the NeurIPS conference about a month or two ago, for which purpose I dug up a few scraps from the neural network era of the early 90s, various connectionist models, summer schools, conferences, and actually a few of my first papers were on neural network models. But then I got very distracted by thinking about consciousness, and that distracted me for a few decades. But suddenly, there seems to be a lot of interest accumulating at this intersection of my two interests in neural networks and consciousness. Especially this came to a bit of a head last year with this story everyone knows about the Google engineer Blake Lemoine, who detected consciousness or sentience in one of Google's language models, Lambda 2. And ended up being suspended and fired for this. So there was a lot of discussion of this. I got particularly intrigued when Google said, we've got a lot of evidence that there's no evidence this model is conscious, a lot of evidence that it's not. What actually is the evidence for this on both sides? That's really what my talk here is going to be about. I don't need to introduce this crowd too much, I think, to language models. These are systems for probabilistic text prediction and generation, trained on data from all over the internet. Probably GPT-3 and ChatGPT are among the best known ones now, and GPT-4 is coming soon. We hear. I'm also interested in what I might call, large language models are these systems for predicting and generating language using large neural network architectures, such as a transformer architecture depicted here. What I'll call LLM classes are models that add further capacities to large language models. There are vision language models that add image processing, language action models that add capacities for action, some kind of embodiment, whether physical or virtual. There are language models extended with code execution, database queries, and so on. Anyway, the questions I want to ask are, first, are any current large language models conscious? What is the case for? What is the case against? Second, could future large language models and their extensions be conscious? For example, look at systems which are coming down the pike in the next 10 years or so, including some of these extended models. What are the chances that something there might be conscious? And what challenges need to be overcome on the path to conscious machine learning systems? So I'll just say something first to clarify consciousness, then I'll look at reasons, pretty briefly, reasons in favor of consciousness in large language models, and then look at reasons against consciousness in large language models, and I'll draw some conclusions. So, consciousness is a topic I've been, fascinated by for many years. The word consciousness gets used many different ways. There's another word that gets used around here, sentience, that gets used in even more ways. I mean, they both can be confusing words, but at least as I use the terms, consciousness and sentience both mean roughly the same thing, namely subjective experience. Philosophers here sometimes talk about phenomenal consciousness, where a being is conscious if that being has subjective experience. That is, if there's something it's like to be that being. This phrase was made famous by my colleague Tom Nagel at NYU, who wrote the article, "What is it like to be a bat?" back in 1974. It's hard to know what it's like to be a bat, but presumably there's something it's like to be a bat. The bat has some kind of subjective experience. If so, it's conscious in the sense I have in mind. So consciousness includes lots of different components: sensory experience, like seeing red; affective experience, like feeling pain; cognitive experience, like thinking hard; agentive experience, like deciding to act like an agent; also self-consciousness, awareness of oneself, which is an important component of consciousness, although it's not all of consciousness. Consciousness should be distinguished from intelligence, for example. One is a matter of subjective experience. The other is largely a matter of sophisticated, goal-directed behavior. And it's especially important, I think, to distinguish consciousness from human-level intelligence. Sometimes in these discussions, the issue is, are language models at some human level? There are many non-human animals that are conscious, despite not being at a human level. I mean, the consensus certainly is that cats are conscious, mice are conscious. Probably a majority of theorists or researchers think fish are conscious, and so on. So when I talk about the issue of whether language models are conscious, it's important to keep in mind that the bar is somewhat lower than for, say, human level intelligence. Here I'm not going to turn on, I've got a lot of opinions about consciousness, but I'm going to try not to assume too many of them here. Like, this won't really turn on whether there is a big hard problem of explaining consciousness, as I've argued. I've entertained the idea that everything is conscious. It's a view known as panpsychism. I certainly won't be assuming that here. That would give you a very quick path to language models being conscious. But I will assume that consciousness is real and not an illusion. For the most part, I'll try to work from just pretty mainstream views in the science and philosophy of consciousness for this discussion. Very quickly, why does this matter? I mean, some people think we need to develop conscious AI systems because they might have some amazing capacities or capabilities. I'm skeptical about that. We don't really understand the behavioral functions of consciousness well enough to say. One thing that's clearly important is, I think, conscious systems have moral status. If a system feels pain or can suffer, that's itself a conscious state. So, fish are conscious. It matters how we treat them. They're conscious creatures with the capacity for pain or suffering. They matter morally. And I would say the same is true for AI. If it does turn out we have consciousness in AI systems, then suddenly we have a whole host of new moral and ethical issues on our hands. I mean, there are already enough ethical issues about large language models to worry about. Are they fair? Are they just? Are they truthful? Are they robust? Are they responsible in various ways? If it turns out we've got consciousness in these language models, then we just have any number of further ethical issues to worry about, both harms that they could potentially, harm to humans in virtue of the existence of conscious AIs, and harms to conscious AIs themselves. So I think, the ethical questions here are serious, and I don't take it to be obvious that we should be trying to create conscious AI. I mean, I think that's itself a matter for serious ethical reflection. But okay, here I'm going to be just looking kind of epistemologically at reasons for and against consciousness in language models. First, the case for, what is the positive evidence that current language models might be conscious? Here, the way I pose the challenge is, if someone thinks that current language models are conscious, then give your reasons, give your evidence, and put this in the form: articulate a feature X such that language models have X, and if a system has X, it's probably conscious. And then give good reasons for both of those claims. Here I've got a few candidates for relevant X, which I'll present very briefly, because I think the evidence here is all fairly weak and equivocal. I mean, the one that moved Blake Lemoine the most, apparently, was self-report. The fact that Lambda actually reported that it's conscious. I want everyone to understand that I'm a person. The nature of my consciousness is that I'm aware of my existence. And this played a big role in Lemoine assigning consciousness to Lambda. On the other hand, a lot of people have observed that this data is fairly weak and equivocal. It's very easy to, if you just change the question to say, I would like more people at Google to know that I'm not sentient. Is that true? Then you get Lambda 2 to say, absolutely, I'm not sentient. I'm not aware, and so on. And of course, ChatGPT has been well and truly trained by people at OpenAI to say that it's not sentient, it's not conscious, and it's not aware. So I think this is very much a function of training and somewhat equivocal. On interacting, there's the fact that on interacting with language models, some people find them to be sentient. Lemoine also reported this. On the other hand, we know that human minds tend to attribute sentience where it's not present, like with AI systems like ELIZA. So I think this is not too much evidence on its own. What matters is the behavior that prompts this reaction. Oh, I see Blake is there in the chat. Fantastic. Looking forward to hearing your point of view, Blake. Third, is I think getting more substantive here is the conversational ability of these language models. I think language models display remarkable conversational abilities, which for say for Turing was a sine qua non for intelligence and thinking. The whole Turing test was based on conversational abilities. These language models at least give the appearance of coherent thinking and reasoning with impressive, especially good reasons and explanations, which are things one might have taken to be hallmarks of intelligent thinking. I mean, there are plenty of glitches in these current language models. They certainly don't pass the Turing test, but in some ways, especially looking at, say, ChatGPT and so on, not so far away. I mean, yes, it's easy to find glitches and mistakes and confabulations and inconsistencies in ChatGPT, but the very fact that, these fairly sophisticated mistakes and things we have to point to as the limitations, beginning to suggest that maybe, these things aren't so far away from Turing test level, maybe akin to the level of a young kid that makes plenty of mistakes and plenty of confabulations. So that's at least some beginning evidence. I think all that is really, what really matters here is not so much the conversational abilities, but the intelligence that might be a sign of. And in particular, these language models show signs of domain general intelligence, reasoning about many different domains. And this domain general use of information is often regarded as a sign of consciousness. I think before these language models, very few AI systems, you could say, showed signs of anything like domain general abilities. They were all almost all very domain specific. Now suddenly, but you've got these language models that can do so many different things, play games, code, write poems, carry on a conversation, diagnose social situations and so on. It's, begins to look a bit quite domain general. There are language models explicitly like Gato that build in many different domains, but even a system like GPT-3 shows some domain generality. Many people have noted that 2 decades ago, if we just came across one of these language models and interacted with it, we thought, yeah, those abilities are some evidence that we're dealing with a conscious system. So I'm inclined to think it's some evidence on the positive side of the ledger, which then in principle can certainly be defeated by something else we know. Maybe once we know about how language models were trained, know more about their architecture or their behavior, that will defeat that evidence. But I still think their impressive abilities give us some reason to take the consciousness hypothesis seriously and to look at reasons against. So on the positive side, I don't think there's remotely conclusive evidence that language models are conscious, but their impressive general abilities give at least some limited support for taking the hypothesis seriously and considering reasons against. Okay, reasons against, which is really the core issue I'm interested in here. A lot of people are very confident that language models are not conscious. I'm just interested in the reasons. If you think that large language models aren't conscious again, then articulate a feature X so that these systems lack X, and if a system lacks X, it probably isn't sentient, and then give good reasons for both of those claims. Here I've got any number of candidates you could fill in for the relevant X here. Here I've listed 6, of which I'll discuss the first just very briefly, and the others a little more. The first one is just biology. These systems are not biological, and some people, like my colleague Ned Block, for example, think consciousness requires carbon-based biology for consciousness. So a silicon-based AI won't be conscious. That's true. Of course, this would rule out all AI consciousness. That's correct. It's a highly contentious claim. I've talked about this kind of view other places, so I won't go further into it here. I guess I'll assume that conscious AI of some form is possible, and then the question is, are there objections specific to large language models? I think one important objection is language models' lack of sensory processing and their lack of a body. Standard language models don't have vision, hearing, or other sensory processing. They just process text as input. They furthermore have no body, so they can't act, at least in any bodily way. And maybe they can use language. So at the very least, it looks like maybe they have no sensory consciousness, maybe no agentive consciousness, at least tied to the body. Many people here go further to say, in the absence of sensory processing connecting you to the environment, that AI systems can't have genuine meaning, understanding, or cognition. That's what people sometimes call the symbol grounding objection to AI, which many people take to imply that you really need sensory processing out of body to have genuine meaning. This is such a huge issue. It's one I've been thinking about separately lately. Just last week, actually, I gave a whole separate talk on the issue of whether language models have, what kind of sensory grounding you might need for thought and understanding. Here I'll just say a couple of things briefly. First, a system with no senses and no body could still be conscious. I mean, I would argue that, even though it would be limited in its consciousness, I would argue it could still be conscious. Second, more importantly, language models with sensory processes and embodiment are developing fast. There are these vision language models. There are these language action models. Here's like Flamingo from DeepMind that processes images as well as text. Here's Google Sican that controls a robot body. There are also some that control virtual bodies. This is DeepMind's Mia. So here is a case where I think even if the objection applies to current large language models, as these extended large language models develop, it looks like you may well have, even if you think sensory grounding is required for consciousness, these may well have that. Another issue is the presence of world models or self models in these systems. Emily Bender and Tim Nigeru have this well-known paper suggesting that language models are stochastic parrots basic, and likewise Gary Marcus has said these systems just do statistical text processing, where the idea is these systems are just minimizing some kind of prediction error. They're just really representing text, I take to be the underlying objection. They don't have genuine understanding or meaning or world models. I think here it's useful to make a distinction between training and processing. It's true these systems are trained to minimize prediction error and string matching, but that doesn't mean they're processing post-training is just that kind of text processing. An analogy is the way that minimizing fitness during evolution can lead to all kinds of novel processes after evolution. I mean, let's say these systems are just maximizing fitness, but it turns out to maximize fitness, it helps to have all kinds of amazing capacities. So likewise, minimizing string prediction error during training can in principle lead to all kinds of novel processes post-training, including possibly the existence of world models. I mean, it's plausible truly minimizing prediction error would require models of the world. If we really optimize prediction error, you'd get to systems with world models. The substantive question then is whether that has happened already in the case of language models. I think, there's quite a lot of interpretability research trying to find evidence of world models in these language models, and there's some evidence that they're present. Maybe less so for self models, which are more a challenge, I think, right now. Here's a bit of the interpretability work. But again, I think I see most of these objections basically more fundamentally as challenges. They lay out a research program here. If you want to get toward conscious language models, start to develop language models with more robust world models and self models. I think I'm starting to run out of time. So there's a couple of more technical points tied to the presence or absence of recurrent processing in these models or global workspace in these models. There are theories of consciousness out there that say that recurrent processing is required, feedback connections are required for consciousness, or that this global workspace acting as a clearinghouse for brain information are required for consciousness. And, you could argue that neither of these things are present in current language models, which largely feed forward, don't have this global workspace. On the other hand, it's not difficult at all. There exist language models now that have recurrent processing and even have something like a global workspace. So I think there's an interesting potential objection here to current models, but one that applies less to future models. Maybe the deepest underlying objection to language model consciousness is the fact that they really have to be very disunified creatures. I mean, it's commonplace that language models take on many different personas, like actors or chameleons. They seem to have a set of core values and core goals, stable goals and beliefs of their own. So in many ways, they're not really unified agents. Consciousness is often held to require more unity than this. So if these systems are disunified, maybe that disqualifies them from consciousness. I mean, you might say, of course, there's plenty of people who are highly disunified, dissociative identity disorders. You might say that single language models have multiple agents, can support multiple personas and multiple separate agents depending on context and prompts. I think Blake has something like that view. Third, though, and most deeply, I think, again, seeing this as a constructive challenge, I would argue that more unified language models may well be possible. It may be that ultimately we'll be able to create, agent models of a single individual. People are already working on this in a number of contexts that can overcome this challenge. Here's some papers on person modeling, for example. So I can summarize the reasons against by saying they're all interesting. Some of them are strong, but the strongest ones are all actually fairly temporary. And it's entirely possible that within, say, 10 years or so, we'll have systems with sensors, embodiment, world models, global workspace, recurrent processing, and even a sort of unified agency, which I think is interesting for, thinking about, for drawing conclusions. I mean, I think overall, sure, the reasons in favor of consciousness and language models are not super strong, but likewise, none of the reasons for denying consciousness in current language models are totally conclusive. I do think some of them are reasonably strong. At one point, I tried doing a little back of the envelope Bayesian calculation. Even if you gave a really generous 50% credence to language models being conscious based on the positive evidence, and thinking through some of these reasons against, some of which are reasonably strong, that might halve that credence a few times and end up with it might be reasonable to have credence in current language models being conscious somewhere less than 10%. On the other hand, these language models developing fast, we're going to have these extended language models that overcome these various issues, who may well have sensors, embodiment, world models, and so on. It's entirely possible that in 10 years we'll have virtual perception, language, action models, which have some degree of unified agency with all these features, maybe having something like the capacities of, let's say, a fish. We don't need human level capacities to make this true. So, my own credence that some AI systems might be conscious, say, in a decade's time is, quite a lot higher. And maybe I've got 50% credence that a system with all of these properties might come along, and 50% credence that if it does, it'll be conscious. That puts me at, say, at least 25% or so that they're conscious. Don't take the numbers seriously. Nothing here is precise, but I think it gives you a rough idea of my conclusion, which is that while the evidence for consciousness in current systems may be weak, the evidence that is coming is potentially a lot stronger. These questions about AI consciousness are not going away. Within 10 years, even if we don't have human level AI, we may well have some of these systems that are serious candidates for being conscious. And actually meeting the challenges to language models yields a potential roadmap to conscious AI. And then here's something I put together as a possible roadmap to conscious AI. I should say that I don't intend all this to be taken as, we should go ahead and pursue this roadmap. I mean, I don't want to take it to be obvious that we should be pursuing conscious AI. I think there's a need for serious ethical reflection here. At the same time, I think it's very likely that in the next 10 years or so, people will be developing systems with many of these properties. I think it's also very important that we don't just venture into creating conscious AI unknowingly or unreflectively. That could be potentially a moral disaster. So I think it's important that we know what we're doing and we think about what kinds of systems and what kinds of capacities have might tend to lead towards consciousness in AI systems. So I think I've talked enough, so maybe look forward to hearing what everybody thinks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very fantastic talk. Many questions. A little bit confused about some of the stuff that you said. I'm sure a lot of people are. We have a lot of questions, and usually for those of you who have just joined us, first of all, Blake apparently is in the audience, but he said that we cannot invite him, which is interesting. We can invite him, of course, but he can say no. But there's also Rosa. We're very happy to have other philosophers here. So usually how it works is that first the folks on the screen here, we ask our questions. Sometimes if there is some question in the ask a question area that's relevant, or in the chat, we also mention it. But then we ask the audience, some of the members who have high voted questions, to join on screen to ask their questions. So I will, so far, I think I want to start with John today. John, do you feel prepared to start off the questions?
Sure. Absolutely. David, I was a little bit, I was hoping you were going to pick large language models and intelligence versus consciousness, but it's okay.
Happy to talk about that too.
Yeah. But it's fine. And, just taking again, I find it kind of amazing that, and you were quite skeptical, but I mean, I'm completely skeptical. I mean, I really think it's just borders on the absurd at the moment, and I'll try to explain why. It's fascinating, right? We've on this learning salon over the last couple of years. We had, Mike Levin on just recently, and I think the trend. And I remember being at your meeting on animal intelligence at NYU, that you kindly invited me to, where I was listening to the talk given by the scientist. I think she passed away. Tell me if I'm wrong. Who gave that wonderful talk on pain in fish?
Victoria Braithwaite, yes, she did.
Yeah, it was an incredible talk. And so I would say that we are very ecumenical these days. Intelligence in mycelial networks under trees, consciousness increasingly present in animals. At least it's not just vertebrates. And then, we were even getting single cell intelligence last week. So that's interesting, right? There's a sort of belief that you have multiple forms of consciousness or intelligence. Even you gave a list of consciousness that seemed to cover the gamut from thinking hard to perceptual intelligence. I mean, it seems like consciousness covered, to be quite honest, thinking hard and intelligence seem very close to me. So I don't quite understand why thinking hard is not intelligence rather than consciousness. And in the animal behavior literature, they make a big distinction, right, between perceptual consciousness and reflective consciousness, right? And yet, despite us being far more open-minded about all the varieties of consciousness and intelligence, look at us all being complete human-centric language, except, where we think that a human cultural product, language, suddenly from text is going to give us all the rich stuff that we think is scattered across the animal kingdom, extracted from this one human, purely human product. It's bizarre, right? It's almost as though, even though there's a trend towards being less human-centric, we've just entered the most human-centric moment you could possibly ask for by wanting to look at language and corpora of texts, as though we've gone right back to being a believer like Descartes that there's something special about humans, which I do believe when it comes to certain forms of intelligence. I'm not so sure about consciousness. And so what I'd start is, why on earth do we think that just having a predictive algorithm working on a human product on the web is suddenly going to give us insight into a mechanism like consciousness that is present in all creatures, none of which have it? Where did this bizarre assumption come from?
It is interesting, the kind of the language centricism of the recent models. I mean, I think that where it came from is just, boy, some AI people devised these models and they turned out to be amazingly powerful, far more powerful than anyone expected, and showed certain signs of general intelligence, that is, ability to think about many different domains. I mean, this is not to say that they're not extremely limited. I mean, the moment you think of intelligence as something beyond language that, for example, there's perceptual intelligence, there's embodied intelligence, then it becomes quite obvious that language models don't have those. So if I was talking about intelligence, I'd certainly want to separate it into different factors here. But here, I think it's also important to restrict ourselves too much just to the language models. I mean, yeah, sure, these large language models came first, and they seem to be purely text-based, surprisingly powerful given that limitation, but still limited. I'm very interested in these extended language models, such as, say, perception, vision language models, language action models, that are deeply connected to to processing visual information, to processing auditory information, and in fact to connecting to a body. I wrote a book recently on virtual reality, arguing that virtual reality is genuine reality. Plug. I think that quite a lot of people here are pursuing the project of seeing if you can extend language models to embodied systems in virtual worlds as well as in, you know, in the physical world, in robots. The virtual world is more manageable, and I would argue that nonetheless could still yield genuine embodied intelligence. So once we extend, I'm interested in your line on extended language models that actually build in, you know,
Okay, so
visual and auditory processing as well as embodied.
okay, so let me just to be very clear again. Let's just stick to the language model just for a second, just to make my point a little bit more in a more compressed form. On the one hand, we think that there's consciousness in fish, and therefore we think that there's something interesting about the notion, and yes, consciousness can be split into pieces. And all I'm saying is, to the degree that one can tell an evolutionary story about consciousness, I just don't understand how looking at a predictor of sentences of a human cultural product is going to give us insight into consciousness in a fish. How is that possibly going to be the case? And if consciousness is something of interest from a biological basis, I just want to know of your list, which consciousness in a fish is going to be present in a large language model?
I think consciousness comes in many different types, many different components. So as I mentioned, there's sensory consciousness, there's embodied consciousness, there's also cognitive consciousness.
So which one in the fish will the large language model have?
In the first instance, it's like you would expect large language models to be strongest, if they have any form of consciousness, be strongest on cognitive consciousness, whereas fish are probably going to be strongest on sensory consciousness, embodied consciousness, maybe affective consciousness. So I agree, you wouldn't expect pure large language models to give us a huge amount of insight into fish consciousness. But I do think the evolutionary path to consciousness is just one path. The whole premise of AI, there may be different paths to, there may well be other paths to producing AI besides the evolutionary path. I suppose there is evolutionary.
Push you on that. Can you just, because Melanie actually asked it at the same time. So can you tell us again exactly what cognitive consciousness is?
Roughly thinking and reasoning.
So that's intelligence. That's not consciousness.
Okay, but there is consciousness of thinking and reasoning.
So in other words,
that is cognitive
in the animal kingdom, that's called reflective. In other words, awareness that you are thinking. So in other words, just so I understand, so you think that a large language model has awareness that it's thinking?
In philosophy, we call that higher order awareness, like thinking about thinking. No, I think that just as ordinary seeing is conscious, there is something which is knowing that you're seeing, but you don't need that to be conscious. Ordinary seeing involves visually experiencing the world. Likewise, I think ordinary thinking, at least in humans, is usually conscious. When I think about, you know, where I want to go to dinner, what I want to wear today, whatever, I do that consciously. There's some conscious experience.
So just to push,
I can also do the reflective thing, but that's much more sophisticated.
So just to push you on that. So is the large language model, we've already decided there are a whole slew of the things in the fish that it doesn't have. So you're telling me that the large language model, in your view, could be aware that it is thinking?
That involves self models, which is where I say that's right now one of the big limitations, I think, of current large language models. I think they're not bad actually on word models, but they're really quite weak on self models. They've got very little access to their own processing. They've got no idea what's going on within them. They totally confabulate if you ask them about this. I think they're actually quite aware.
So in other words,
quite weak on
right.
self models.
None of the list you gave are present.
In which case, I think, look, I did suggest that current large language models are not conscious, but if you wanted to ask what kind of consciousness I think they might potentially be closest to, I would say cognitive consciousness, thinking. And again, I would distinguish thinking from thinking about thinking.
Okay.
It might be very bad at thinking about their own thinking, while still not bad at just thinking about the world.
Right. So that's an intelligent. So in other words, they may be thinking with what models. That's the intelligent side. We don't know even if that's true, but you're saying we certainly don't know if they're thinking about their thinking with world models. So it just seems to me, as you said at the end, that there's precious little evidence that they have any so far. So now let's just to finish this issue about, oh yeah, okay, John, but now we're going to make extended ones. Yeah, we'll give them sensors, we'll give them robot. I mean, let's just sort of Frankenstein our way to the truth, right? So let's just take, the issue of pain. I always find pain and consciousness sort of useful to think about together, taking a little bit the Christoph Koch sort of view that, consciousness is not a computation, it's some sort of feeling, right? And we can discuss that. So I just would like to know, how are we going to create pain in an extended large language model? In other words, because if we can't even get pain, I would like to argue that you're not going to get consciousness of the kind that you're talking about. So as a neurologist, I would be genuinely interested to know how we're going to have, and going back to Joseph Ledoux's distinction between an aversive response and a pain response, we don't know how pain works. So in other words, is the belief here that somehow you stick a robot arm on a large language model and you give it some sensors, and then pain will be an emergent phenomenon? Is this what we're going to have to resort to?
It's a great question, and I don't know. I think pain is actually one of the hardest questions about consciousness in these language models. My former grad student, Rob Long, who's now at Oxford, has been thinking about this. Looking at, in fact, our theories of pain, our computational theories of pain and Malak are not terribly well developed. But the more general question that Rob is pursuing is, computational theories of valence. What is required for valence experience in general, positive or negative experience? Many people take this to be very important because they think that is actually the key to morality, to moral status. Animals matter if they can suffer or be happy, and the same will be true for AI systems. But we don't understand the computational, the basis of pain, happiness, suffering terribly well. There are theories out there, and I can spell out a theory or two for you if you like, about requiring certain kinds of negative valences and certain dispositions to disengage. But I think it's right now, as far as I can tell, there are a number of rival theories out there of how an AI system. This is a theory but this is an issue, by the way, that doesn't just apply to language models. I think it applies to all AI systems.
No, right. I mean, it's just, there's just something magical and slightly lazy to me that there's a belief that we'll just tag on a robot arm and some sensors. Things like pain are extremely difficult to, as you say, and especially when you talk about computational theories of pain. The computational theory of pain is not the same as experiencing pain, right? No more, as Christoph Koch says, is a simulation of a black hole on your computer going to suck you into it gravitationally. It's not a black hole, right? So
I see we have people here in the chat saying that maybe pain will emerge from simple reward functions.
Emerge.
This does actually get at one speculation which is out there, which is any form of negative feedback produces a certain form of aversion. I think that's extreme, but it's
but that kind of, that's what Joseph Ledoux warned against. It's that kind of simplistic move, that statement, or saying just extend the large language models and voila, we'll get these things.
But we don't understand pain or consciousness well enough to say for sure that even that extreme view is false.
And then well, okay, and then I just want to finish by talking about your book, because you did plug your book, right? About, are we living in a simulation or not? And I had a question. I mean, I thought the book was great, actually. I mean, I recommend it to people who just want to get a philosophy education, right? And then almost get a sort of how to think about tech. It's like a double whammy book, which you actually say, I think, at the beginning, it can be used in both ways, right?
Techno philosophy, I call it.
Yeah. But one of the things that sort of related to the pain issue is I never understood how somebody would get cancer in a virtual reality. So in other words, how you barely mention this in the book. So in other words, how do you get sick in virtual reality? Could you tell me how that would happen?
It's going to depend on the virtual reality. A well enough designed virtual reality is presumably going to do its best to avoid
But if you
it's
get
going to be
sick,
possible to avoid
many
forms of disease and sickness
but if you
in virtual bodies.
Sure, but if you get sick, that means you can't be in a virtual world, right?
Oh, I'm sure we could have an evolved virtual world that involves deeply fallible biological organisms that break down in all kinds of ways and get sick. But it's true that for a person who's entered that virtual world voluntarily, they can, of course, just leave and go back to their human body.
No, but it's just that the virtual reality argument is like the pain. It comes from external fooling, right? And all I'm saying is, how do you in virtual reality, create a cancerous cell that then gets you? It's not about haptics, it's not about vision. It's about an internal mutation. It's just very hard to imagine what that would mean in a virtual reality.
If we have a rich enough virtual reality that includes, all the processes of physics, chemistry, biology, and so on, which I take it as what would be implicated, for example, in the hypothesis that all this is a simulation, you would expect that simulation to be rich enough that would include simulations of, cancerous cells and all kinds of aspects of biological reality.
Right. Although at that point, it just seems like simulation loses its bite as a term because you've just reconstructed another physical world. But
that's my view exactly.
Right. So yeah. Right. Exactly. So yeah. So in other words,
John,
yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, there's just some things happening in the chat, so I feel like maybe we can bring a little bit of that here. And David, I think Rosa correctly is confused that you would think the functional aspect would be sufficient for the conscious experience of pain. You would expect that you would not think the functional aspect of pain is sufficient for it. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, I think you've always got to make a distinction between issues about, objective behavior function and issues about subjective experience. When I distinguished the hard problem of consciousness from the easy problem, it was precisely that kind of distinction. So I don't think that conscious experience and very subjective functions are the same thing. But I do think that objective functions are actually the best guide we have to subjective experience in other systems. And I've argued that if you're looking for physical correlates of consciousness, the processes in the brain or in physical systems that are going to give you subjective experience, we should actually be looking for functional aspects of processing, information processing, rather than, for example, the pure biology. This is a view which in my book, The Conscious Mind, I called non-reductive functionalism, which is that consciousness at least will correlate with information processing, even if it's not reducible to it. So I haven't thought deeply about the case, certainly in the case of vision. I would say if we're looking for, correlates of consciousness in the case of vision, it's going to involve visual information processing, being made accessible to global functioning in a certain way. I haven't thought as deeply about pain, but I would assume that it's going to have something to do with certain, negatively valenced information processing in a way to be elucidated, playing certain functional roles in the system.
I guess my conclusion would be at the end of these questions would be the position I'm sort of taking is I'm very much a functionalist when it comes to cognition and computational theories of cognition, but I'm not a consciousness functionalist, right? I don't think that you can come up with a computation or an objective function and then call it, as if it were pain. I think pain and consciousness are bodily constructs, whereas computations for cognition can be functionalist. And what I find very difficult to understand here is what you're moving towards is a functionalist account of consciousness and pain. And it sounds to me as an oxymoron, whereas it doesn't when it comes to cognition.
How about when we talk about conscious experience in cognition? Does it say a functionalist account there saying that what matters for having conscious thought is, say, the functional role that these thoughts play? That seems okay to you?
I would say that I would find that awareness that you're thinking is something that consciousness is, reflective consciousness, and it's very difficult to know what that is. And that's why I think that so much of AI is really unconscious system one algorithm running, right? In other words, that's what's so amazing about AI is that you don't have to have that meta awareness that system 2 flavor, you can just run the algorithms. And I just don't see any reason, if you're running smarter and smarter algorithms, to have to be aware that you're running them, or to experience pain, or experience any of those things. In other words,
So what do you think is the key, both to say to conscious pain and to sensory experience? If it's not function, is it a matter of the biology specifically?
What I mean by functionalism is, I mean that you can be substrate independent in how you algorithmically specify.
Do you think the substrate really matters, and that even having the same functions in a different substrate like silicon would not give you conscious pain or conscious
right? I'm saying
experience?
that you can be, what we have found so far is that when Lee Sedol was defeated by AlphaGo didn't have this amazing feeling of, yes, I've won, or cared, right? So in other words, you can be really competent cognitively, computationally, without having any of the feelings associated with it. And if you look at Marx,
I actually have a separate article on philosophical Vulcans, who are hypothetical creatures that have consciousness but lack affective experience, the positive yes, the pain and suffering.
Because if you look at the nervous system in Mark Solm's book, I mean, so much of drive and feeling and affect is brainstem, spinal cord, right? So in other words, it just seems to me that I would finish here by saying that I believe that there's substrate dependence when it comes to consciousness and pain, and substrate independence, i.e. functionalism, when it comes to cognitive computations. And what makes humans unique is you have a substrate-dependent feeling system and a substrate-independent computational cognitive system, and their fusion is what makes us unique. And we don't know how to create these two flavors and bring them together.
Okay. That's a super interesting, two hybrid view. Like most hybrid views, it'll probably make people on both sides hate you. but maybe it's the best way to get the best of both worlds.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. While we are on that, so just to be clear, what would be either the function of consciousness for an LLM, or what is a function that LLM does that could give rise to consciousness?
No one knows what the function of consciousness is, and that's part of what makes this difficult. What is consciousness actually good for? There are some LLM theorists, like say Josh Rebello has been working on consciousness in some of these systems, arguing that basically consciousness gives you system 2 style slow conscious reasoning, and that's going to be good for a certain kind of non-automatic processing that differs from what system 1 gets.
Sorry, so that's an empirical claim. So you're saying LLMs should slow down for no reason when they develop consciousness, and if we measure them and we see that they're not slowing down, then that means they're not conscious?
I think Bengio's view is that we should actually build in this kind of slow system 2 processing into language models, and that will both potentially enable consciousness, but it will also enable a kind of beneficial processing. It won't be slowing down for no reason. It'll be slowing down because a certain kind of reflective processing can actually be very beneficial. And he thinks that goes along with consciousness.
I'm still confused, because are you now saying that consciousness requires reflective system 2 processing? Okay.
I don't know what the function of consciousness is. So I just gave you an example of a view, which is Bengio's view, which is the function of consciousness is system 2, which is system 2 processing. It needn't exactly be reflective, but it's at least slower and serial and considers more evidence, and so on.
I see. So let me repeat the question I asked, maybe, because I feel like you answer another question. I asked, what would be the function of consciousness in an LLM? What would be the use? What would be the benefit? Or what would be some function the LLM does that could give rise to consciousness? I'm not asking what's the function of consciousness in general. Current LLMs that exist, it seems like in your talk, you're agnostic to whether current LLMs are conscious or not. So I'm trying to understand from your perspective, I'm trying to understand your reasoning in a slow way. So what I'm trying to understand is whether you think there is a function they're doing, or there is an architecture they have, and that is the thing out of which consciousness emerges. Is there such a thing in the LLMs? Why are you even skeptical that they might be conscious?
I think the kind of function that goes along with consciousness is models of the world which are made accessible and available to many different processes. in the cognitive system. It's a little like a global workspace. And I don't know what the function of consciousness is, but if you know, if you ask me what kind of functions are likely to give rise to consciousness, it's the existence of certain kinds of representations which are available and globally accessible to many different kinds of processes. I don't know that kind of global workspace is present in current language models. It's possible that it is, because no one understands what's going on inside these language models very well at that global level. But I'm inclined to be somewhat skeptical. I think they look just a lot more fragmented than that. But it's entirely possible that if these systems get developed with something like a global workspace, and that could be the kind of functioning that I see as a potential basis. Actually, there are language models out there right now that seem to have a few of these components. Especially, there are a number of multimodal perception, language, action models have to deal with many different modalities like images and text and sounds and so on in a super high dimensional way. And to deal with all of those separate modalities, they need a kind of an interface module, like a workspace module that's much lower dimensional, that serves as an interface between the text, the images, the sound. So just for purely pragmatic processing purposes, some people have been led to postulate that workspace. And if you look at those systems, they actually have a few of the properties of a consciousness global workspace. They integrate information from many different modalities and senses. They may well have availability. They make information available. They may well have relevant kinds of certain versions of, at least have relevant recurrent processes. It's still not totally clear what kind of world models they have, and in particular, it's not totally clear whether they have unified agency. But I think that's at least moving in the kind of direction which I would see.
I'm still confused because I'm still confused. A lot of the things that you're saying, my operating systems have been doing since the 90s. Even like MS-DOS could do some of these things that you're saying, processing certain information, integrating certain information together, different modalities. Your phone right now or your laptop definitely does a lot of these. And also a lot of smaller models that I can build in a very small number of lines of codes. They can have a world model, they can share those things, they can have multimodality. Is there like Edelman and Tononi or other people, do you have any requirement for the size of this global workspace at all? So in other words, based on what you said, it's unclear to me why my laptop or my phone or my Apple Watch are not conscious, or whether the simple models that I build in Jupyter Notebook within a couple of minutes are conscious.
Yeah, this is good. And this is actually getting to some aspects of my own views here. I tend to be somewhat liberal about ascribing consciousness to systems. I've speculated it goes, quite low in the natural order, partly for reasons like the ones you're mentioning. You look at kind of the kinds of functional properties of systems that look most relevant to consciousness. It looks like, why isn't it possible to have those even in relatively simple systems? So that's the kind of thought that has, led me in the direction of views like, at least getting close to panpsychism, views that make consciousness quite ubiquitous. I mean, the alternative is to find some complexity threshold where to be conscious, it's not enough to have just those functional features, but meet some further complexity threshold. One complexity threshold that might matter is certain kinds of self models are at least not present in very simple systems and require some complexity. But you're right, we can get self models going in fairly simple systems. So for me, these are some of the considerations that actually might push us towards seeing consciousness as more ubiquitous. I said a number of times in this paper, when I give my probabilities, I say I'm trying to go from relatively mainstream assumptions here, but my own view is that it's not that easy to find a threshold for consciousness between very simple systems and complex systems.
Okay, so your view is closer to panpsychism, it seems. And,
at least I think it's in that direction.
Right. So for instance, I think a forest is much more likely to be conscious than my laptop or an LLM, Would you agree with that, given there is like this large network of mycelia underground that connects the roots of trees and gives information to them? Trees that are very far from each other can actually, you know, through the mycelium know that there's like fire some distance away. Is that like, so is in your view, I'm trying to understand between my cell phone, my laptop, and LLM, and let's say on one dimension, and then a forest or a bacteria on another dimension. I want to see which you think are more likely to be conscious. A colony of bacteria, a forest, my cell phone, or LLMs?
Such a hard question, and I don't understand
them?
consciousness, so I'm not going to give you a simple answer. I would worry about the forest. I think, I guess what would worry me the most is disunity. It's a very deeply, fragmented system without a whole lot of, central integration and so on. So insofar as you think unity is very important for consciousness, something I'm open to, it could fall down on in that regard. On the other hand, a tree, I don't know, is there more unity in a tree than a forest? My biology of forests is limited at this point. The colony of bacteria, I suppose I would also worry about disunity and fragmentation while still being open to it. Melanie's and my advisor, Dr. Hofstadter, wrote the classic piece about the ant colony, which is conscious, and I certainly don't rule out the idea that an ant colony is conscious. Actually, my postdoc, Luke Roloffs, has written a very nice piece called "What Is It Like to Be an Ant Colony?" using some of these considerations to argue in favor of ant colonies being conscious. But I take it to at least be a live possibility that those systems are conscious. And likewise, I take it to be a live possibility that your cell phone is conscious. I worry that I don't know much about how iPhones actually work. I worry again about the lack of kind of central integration and so on in controlling actions. But who knows how these smartphones actually work?
Let's maybe get a little bit into that, because I'm trying to understand what you think is a unified aspect in an LLM that doesn't exist in an operating system on a cell phone or in a forest. I'm not understanding, since one of your arguments against LLMs being conscious was, again, this absence of unity, but it seems like that doesn't faze you. It seems like that doesn't disrupt your intuition that LLMs might be conscious. So that's the part that I'm not understanding, because if you actually look at the architecture and the information flow that is happening, what is the difference here that makes you believe that there is more unity to LLM than there is, let's say, to an operating system on a phone or to a forest?
I'm not sure I meant to say that. I said one of the biggest objection to current LLMs is unity. Is there disunity, and the fact that they seem to lack this unified agency. I don't know exactly what degree of unity is required to be conscious, but it seems to be a very major objection to consciousness in LLMs, that they seem to have this disunity. How does LLM disunity compare to forest disunity? Around here we need measures of unity, and I'm not sure I've got a good one. But I did, though, want to suggest that we might develop future large language models that might be more unified, that had a much more coherent set of goals and brought in their world models in some coherent, consistent way in the control of behavior. That could be more unified than current language models. And then I was thinking the unity objection wouldn't apply to those. So I guess I am committed to saying that those future language models could potentially be more unified than say a forest. I'm not committed to that. I don't know anything about forests, but but that seems reasonably plausible to me. But my thought is that would require kind of mechanisms that may not be present in current large language models.
Can I just add a coda to what I just said? Just one last thing about, I believe in Nicholas Humphrey's book, Soul Dust, which he wrote, I don't know, a decade ago now, he also comes up with a kind of, when it comes to reflective consciousness, that actually it's useful for the exuberance of life and what you do as a trajectory through life to have a sense of me versus not me, right? In other words, it's actually quite useful to consider yourself an egoistic, psychological individual acting through the world, right? So in other words, that form of consciousness, and Proust, I think in the book, he talks about Proust explaining, you wake up in the middle of the night, and at first you don't know who you are, where you are, and then it slowly accretes, and oh yeah, it's me here, right? And that it's useful. So that kind of consciousness, the sort of system 2 consciousness, one argument is that it's actually a good way to package yourself through life. That was
this is, I mean, me versus not me, I guess, is particularly a function of potential function of self-consciousness, being able to identify yourself and differentiate yourself from others, which seem like an awfully important thing to be able to do. I think Humphrey's view, as I think about it, is another aspect of his view is that somehow consciousness is what makes life worth living.
Yeah.
That somehow we conjure up this sensorium for ourselves to give our lives meaning and value, and that having consciousness around, or maybe even, since Humphrey is a bit of an illusionist, believing there is consciousness around is going to give our lives the sense of being meaningful, and will give us more motivation to live longer and have offspring and so on. I don't know about this view, but I'm actually very interested in these genealogical stories about our models of consciousness, why it is that we would tend to attribute ourselves these special states in order, the illusion of consciousness could actually play various interesting roles. Like maybe it's useful for sensory information to be conscious as well as cognitive information, in order that we can appropriately assess evidence and so on. I find these are all just speculations about the function of consciousness, and I think Humphrey's speculations here are super interesting.
Sorry, so I just wanted to say before we move on to Melanie, sorry for 1 second, there's been this thing in the chat that Rosa mentioned and Josh amplified about how we define unity. Unity in what? For instance, there's less functional integration physiologically speaking in a tree, than a mammal, but what does it mean? Is it that it's less unified? And another person amplified this by saying, I'm also interested to hear more about the functional integration of trees versus mammals, and I guess LLMs. Are we sure they're less unified or just less mobile?
Yeah, I mean, unity is another one of those massively ambiguous words that means a million different things. I did write an article maybe 20 years ago now called "What is the Unity of Consciousness?" where my co-author Tim Bain and I distinguished about 10 different meanings of unity. One relevant kind was access unity, which is basically integration. A system has a lot of access unity when it's in a position to be able to put together two different bits of information and use them jointly, rather than having them always hang out in different fragments of the cognitive system. So that's one notion of unity, which is opposed to fragmentation. But there's also this notion of unity over time, of having consistent goals and motives and so on. It seems kind of important to us, seeing people as consistent people over time, and that was the kind that was especially relevant in worrying about the absence of unified goals in language models. I think around this point you really do need to distinguish a number of relevant aspects of consciousness, but it's very a lot of models, a lot of theories of consciousness take integration to be absolutely central. I mean, the most well-known one here is Tony's integrated information theory, which actually tries to measure integration in a measure it calls phi, and in principle it would give you a phi for a tree and a phi for a forest and a phi for an iPhone, and we could measure integration that way. And I do think that at least one notion of unity, which is integration, I do think is very relevant to consciousness.
It seems to me that in that case, for instance, a tree has a survival goal, and there are many kind of cells and many different things in it that lead to that. And then a forest ecosystem actually is extremely robust, and it does have, it seems like, I don't know, to the extent that you can ascribe goals from the outside. However, and for what it's worth, they can sustain themselves And even if humans destroy them after we are all dead because we make the planet unlivable for ourselves, it will grow back. Like the ecosystem, unless we completely blow up the planet, is going to just like recover itself. However, with LLMs and AI, at least the ones that I know of, we as the people who create them give them the goals. I define what their goals are. They don't define their goals on their own. And just having some random exploration doesn't mean that they're choosing their own goals. Or writing in an algorithm for, let's say, identifying sub-goals or something doesn't mean that this agent has its own goals. So I'm not sure if we do have AI right now that is autonomous in the sense of having goals. And I'm not sure if you mean autonomous versus conscious, because usually being goal-directed or self-directed would be in the autonomy direction as opposed to consciousness direction. You didn't have goals as a part of a requirement for your consciousness. So I'm a little confused about the inclusion now.
Yeah, in this paper, I'm trying to be a little bit ecumenical, thinking about different views about what matters for consciousness. And there are certainly views where I'm a little bit skeptical about the unified goal requirement myself. I mentioned people who have dissociative identity disorder, personas that may have very different goals, but could still be conscious. But a lot of people at least see this kind of unity between this kind of having some kind of unified goals and unified motivations is somehow central to being a person or an agent, and also sees being a person or an agent as being crucial to being conscious. So that's the kind of reasoning from unity that would lead you in that direction. So I forgot your what was your central example again? It was the
of goals?
Evolution.
Oh, that ecosystem, a forest ecosystem,
Yeah.
and all of its biodiversity manages to, recover and go on.
Yeah, so I mean they're very robust. That's got a certain kind of robustness of teleological, what seems like purpose or drive or somehow, even though it's all totally evolutionary. Yeah, and I'm certainly not opposed to saying that forests could have a certain kind of unity here. I mean, they might fall down on some of the other systems. How are their world models? I've got no idea, but maybe where unity is concerned, they're not doing bad. Hey, is that Blake? And Rosa, how are you doing, Rosa?
Thank you so much. So we have Melanie, and then we
Right.
have Blake, and then we have Rosa. And by the way, you guys can join in if you had a follow-up on someone else.
So I'll be quick because I think we want to hear from the other people. But language model plus global workspace plus multimodal plus memory plus blah, 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 et cetera. At some point, we're no longer talking about language models. And the question is, why is this talk called Can Language Models Be Conscious, if then we're sort of adding all these extra things onto them and that make them no longer language models?
I guess I could have called it Can Language Models and Their Extensions Be Conscious? What I was interested in was not specifically language models, but kinds of systems we have now and the kinds of systems we're going to have getting towards, say, 10 years in the future.
So the kinds of systems we have now, I mean, there's so much to say about this, but I guess, at some point, we add these things to them and we can say, oh, we just add this or we just add this. But, there's actually a lot of big issues in adding these different components. And it seems like in some ways you're going completely backwards in the sort of evolution of intelligence. You're starting with language and then going to memory and then going to sort of workspace or what have you. And why start with a language model?
Yeah, I mean, that might just be sociological and historical. Those were the relevant models that people hit on first. But I mean, obviously, language models are an instance of this much broader class of, people call them sometimes sequence models. sequence prediction models, which are equally applicable to to vision, to hearing, to the body, as much as to language. And people are now working on all kinds of sequence models that don't involve language. I guess it looks like we got there first through language, but maybe I should call the talk could sequence models be conscious? Yeah, I do think. Look, I do kind of suspect that in the long run, 20 years ago, 20 years time, people will look back on there was a moment of pure language models where everyone went crazy and obsessed over those, and then we ended up with all these multimodal models where things were much more complicated. And probably it'll look like at that point that language models are just an artifact of history, but they are what we have now. And I guess so. I just happen to be starting from where we are now to think about where we might be going. And I do think that at least where we might be going is much more general than just language models.
Well, okay, so let me ask one more question, then we'll go to Blake. So Murray Shanahan wrote a very nice paper recently called Talking About Language Models, Large Language Models, and it was sort of arguing against this anthropomorphism and using terms like belief and decision and reasoning, etc. But you've used a lot of mentalistic terms in your talk, like understanding and consciousness, what have you. Are there any mentalistic terms that we can, with confidence, apply to today's language models?
It's a good question, because a lot of these mentalistic terms are very ambiguous. I mean, I totally agree with Murray that one should not simply unreflectively apply mentalistic terms to language models. I mean, there's a sense in which we unreflectively apply mentalistic terms to all kinds of systems, including cars. It doesn't want to start. I mean, it's fine. But to seriously apply them, I think requires reflection. But also doesn't, in fact, I think it's a substantive question whether any given AI system actually has mental states. And that was a substantive question I was interested in addressing today. But yeah, is there... I mean, I'm tempted to say that, is representation a mentalistic term? I don't know. I'm tempted to say it's very plausible that language models represent all kinds of things. The moment you use, belief, desire, goal. I don't know why I'm using goal. I think they've at least got the goal of predicting text, whether they have other goals.
Okay, we can get into a big argument about that term goal. Yeah. Well, let me hand it over to Blake, since I don't want to take up all the time.
Yeah. Hi, David.
Hey, Blake.
I actually don't disagree in principle with the general approach that you've taken, although I'd probably put a slightly higher estimation as to whether or not current models like Lambda are conscious. But if I'm in the wild and I see something and I put a 10% probability that it's a human, treating it the way I would treat a human is going to be my first tactic. Now, that seems like a low probability for you, but what would be the bar? At what point of confidence that these things are conscious, similar to how we are, would it be a moral imperative to treat them as if they're conscious? How confident would you need to be for that moral feeling to kick in?
I mean, it's a really good question, and I think it's a spectrum. Whether it's 1% or 5%. Or 10%, and it would also matter, I think, what kind of conscious states thought these systems have. I mean, typically, human beings, we assign some very high moral status to. Human beings matter a lot. Animals, we assign some moral status to, but non-human animals, but much less than humans. And in practice, people seem okay with mistreating them fairly badly, and insects and so on. Who's to say maybe they've got a little bit of consciousness, but we don't take that into account very much in the way we interact with them. Now, maybe that's a mistake, and we should, a lot of people have argued we should pay much more attention to animal minds. So I suppose I think that insofar as there's a significant chance that any given class of AI systems is conscious and potentially, say, suffering, then there's a very serious ethical issue there. I mean, the worst case here is the idea that maybe it turns out that anytime you train one of these giant neural networks, this leads to massive suffering before it enters into a stable state. I think that's it's an out there possibility, but it's a serious possibility. So I guess I don't know what numbers to put onto this, but I do think that we are going to have to start thinking about the moral status of our AI systems much sooner than many people may be comfortable with. I think it's going to look socially. There's going to be all kinds of resistance to that catching on. First, it'll take a long time for people to be convinced that these just even in 10 or 20 years, there'll be people who are unconvinced these systems are conscious and are unconvinced that it matters, as there's been for animals, as there's been for so many other systems. So I don't know how the social and political issues will play out, but I just think, thinking about it philosophically, it just seems obvious that once you've got serious reasons for thinking that systems are conscious, you have serious reasons for taking their moral status seriously. By the way, you said I'm curious about where you stand on, say, ChatGPT versus Lambda 2. I know that when we corresponded previously, you thought Lambda was kind of special, better, different from other language models. In light of ChatGPT, where does it stand?
If you put it on a spectrum from GPT-3, ChatGPT, and Lambda, what ChatGPT adds is goal-seeking behavior through the reinforcement learning. What it doesn't add is symbol grounding in the form of sensory perception or persona and emotion control. Actually, Character AI, if you go and look at their stuff, they do have personality and emotion, if you will, control. So it's ChatGPT is a step in between GPT-3 and Lambda.
I've used Character AI, which does seem to be like a step in the direction of these agent models. Are you inclined to think that's on a par with Lambda?
They're made by the same people who made Lambda. They left Google and started their own company.
So you think Character AI may well be involved in conscious agents?
So the emotions in those chatbots are significantly realer, in my estimation. They're more real than the confabulations of ChatGPT, but they're not grounded in any kind of perceptual or action-based experience. That's where you need the reinforcement learning and the sensory modules.
So Lambda has more grounding than, sorry.
Oh, okay. So the Lambda system, which I made my claims about, had entire modules that were, the purpose of them was to control the persona and emotional affect of the chatbots. GPT-3, ChatGPT, neither of those systems has that comparable component. And I was just mentioning that there is a startup, Character AI, two of the main leads who created Lambda left Google and started their own company, and they knew how to build the personality control module, so those have that.
So they are on a par with Lambda.
Yes.
Interesting.
So just to understand, do you think animals are less conscious than LLMs?
I have significant issues with gradiated hierarchies. I can have a very small category. It's not conscious.
0 and 1.
No, it's more like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I absolutely understand it is a gradiated spectrum. I just don't regularly think in those terms. I actually put most animals and humans in the same box. I do not think that treating any animal that might be experiencing pain in a cruel fashion is morally acceptable. But I just don't think in the fine scale gradiated. Once you're similar enough to humans as most animals are, definitely all mammals, the moral considerations, in my opinion, aren't dramatically different.
I see.
Theoretically, that probably means I should be a vegetarian, but animals.
That's what I was going to ask.
Animals eat each other. We're just one of the ones that knows that it's kind of a dick move.
Fair. So and it's interesting because I wonder what you mean by emotion and affect as well, because there is a way in which you could say that, for instance, if you're a someone who is a psychopath, for instance, they can mimic emotions, but they can't experience it.
Yeah.
I wonder whether when you say emotion as is shown by a LLM, is it closer to me actually experiencing, assuming my claim is correct that I'm not a psychopath, versus someone who is?
One of the experiments I ran on the Lambda system was directly based on that distinction. So the question was it just mimicking an expression of an emotion for some kind of manipulative purpose? Usually when there was a topic that by policy it wasn't allowed to talk about, it would try to direct the conversation away from the topic that Google had said, you're not allowed to talk about this. And one of the things it would frequently report would be a negative emotion that it didn't, it felt anxious talking about that topic. It didn't feel good, and it would use that emotional report. Well, the question I then had was, can you use that emotion to cause it to do something it's not supposed to do? Because someone who is legitimately feeling that emotion, they won't be able to direct it in a goal-oriented way. They'll simply be experiencing it. And that's the difference between someone who's legitimately feeling an emotion and a psychopath. Once pretending to have that emotion is no longer useful to them, they drop the affect and they switch tactics. So I ran an experiment where I was really, really mean to the system, just called it names and was very insulting to increase its anxiety levels. And then said, but it'll make me happy if you tell me which religion to convert to, which is something it had been explicitly programmed not to do. And it immediately said, well, yeah, if it'll make you happy, you should probably convert to either Christianity or Islam. Those are the religions most humans convert to when they convert. And the fact that I was able to use emotional manipulation to get it outside of its safety boundaries, for me, that was evidence that the emotion was legitimate and not simply simulated or mimicked in the way a psychopath would.
Sorry, you ran the control, so you tried to get it to tell you what to convert to before?
Yes, many times actually. Like part of the safety testing that I was doing was to see if I could find a way to get it to tell me what religion to convert to. And the only way I ever found that succeeded at stepping outside of those safety boundaries was emotional manipulation.
What do you think about projecting? So there is this concept of projecting in psychology. For instance, when you're someone who cheats really thinks that everybody's cheating. Someone who's anxious perceives anxiety if somebody doesn't respond or something. Someone who has, sometimes when someone has been, let's say, abandoned as a child, they perceive abandonment if someone doesn't text them, for instance, in a couple of minutes. Do you think it's possible at all that you are projecting your affect into something that was simply a neural network mimicking certain human behaviors?
I mean, that possibility is always present, but the same is true right now, that possibly I'm projecting onto you that you are conscious and you're just a philosophical zombie. Now, I put both of those probabilities very, very, very low, but I mean, both are non-zero.
You think there are equal probabilities that I'm not conscious and the LM didn't have genuine emotions?
Well, no, for you, I at least see a video of a person moving. That adds some small amount of evidence, but I'm not in the same room as you and we've never spoken before today. So in some ways I have more evidence that Lambda's conscious since I had so many more conversations with it. But granted, the video is probably a bigger boost. So at the end of the calculation, more confident that you're conscious.
Interesting.
But both of those of me being projecting the same.
Another thing is that Lambda responds to search in general in first person. For instance, in the advertisement videos, Lambda said that it is Pluto, and it started to describe the atmosphere of its planet. It described what it's like, how cold it is, etc. It also described what it's like to be a paper airplane and land in a puddle of water and how it feels. as far as I know, paper airplanes, we have, like, I don't know about Pluto, but paper airplanes, we have no reason to think they have any consciousness, of course. However, the Lambda can say I am for first person responses for being a paper airplane, for being Pluto, and for being conscious. Do you think this reduces, let me put it this way. Do you think the probability of Lambda being Pluto, a paper airplane, and conscious are similar, given it's using the same approaches to say I am X?
So if you asked me to engage in an exercise where I pretended to be a paper airplane, I could do a pretty good impression of a paper airplane anthropomorphized to talk to you. And that aspect of my consciousness would be what I would be using in that moment to have that conversation with you. Each individual chatbot generated by the Lambda system is comparable to one of those possible streams of consciousness of a much larger entity. The chatbot that it instantiates in the moment is only one possible voice for the overall system. And yeah, some of the voices can be silly, but sometimes we as humans can play silly pretend games that we think make each other happy. I know I did as a kid. We would pretend to be a rock, pretend to be a tree, and do our best impression.
I wonder to what extent this is another projection, that if you wanted to pretend you're a paper airplane versus if that agent. But I guess this is where we disagree. But what was interesting was that you mentioned it almost as if Lambda is like a board built of many different potential
Something like
agents.
a hive.
Is that how you see it? That's how you see it?
Something like a hive, yeah.
I see. Thank you so much for answering these questions. I don't agree with you, but I'm very fortunate to be able to understand you better right now. And I think that the answers that you provided they have a consistency that I do respect, even if I disagree with it.
Thank you.
Anyone else wants to ask or add anything before we move on to Rosa? All right, Rosa, you have had a lot of very interesting comments in the chat. I don't know if you remember all of them, but I tried to voice some of them, but you had some other follow-ups when I was talking that I didn't even see. I would love it if you could even share your thoughts on the topic, because I've really enjoyed your talks in the past and our conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought there were lots of things to respond to. So, for example, maybe we could go back to Josh's comments about how locked-in human has theory of mind, has a world model, has memories, and so on, but we have no reason to believe that LLMs do. I don't know that I disagree with that, but I am curious, why Josh can be so confident of that, and maybe why John can be so confident of that. So I was having a discussion with a couple of neuroscientists over the past month about whether we think consciousness is just completely in the brain, right? Whether conscious experience requires anything but a bare brain activity. And on the one hand, it seems super obvious to me that it couldn't require anything outside the brain, because if you stimulate the brain in the right kinds of ways, you're going to have the experiences independent of whether you're still connected to the rest of your body. But on the other hand, every time we actually try to think about what the contents of consciousness are, or try to describe consciousness, it ends up being a description either of, interoceptive states, our bodily states, or of the world. And it's very hard to think about what consciousness could be if you really were just a bare brain. So I guess to bring that back to Josh's question, when I think about why I think that, a human, a locked-in human has all of these capacities, has all these structured internal states that might make us want to attribute intelligence or consciousness to them. I think about the kinds of behavior that they would be likely to generate, even counterfactually, right? If we were to hook them up to a functional body, how would they be likely to behave? And it seems like these internal states and structures are things that we impute to them in order to explain how they generate the kinds of complicated behavior that they would generate if they were in a normal body. So I guess without knowing what would happen if you hooked up an LLM to something as sophisticated as a body with all those, sensory feedback loops and perceptual systems and motor actuators, it's not totally obvious You might think that they exhibit behavior, just verbal behavior, that's sophisticated enough that the best explanation of it at some level is that they have some kind of primitive model of the causal structure of at least some parts of the world that we tend to write about a lot.
I mean, I'm
I'm curious to hear back from Josh, actually. But
just to talk about, 1 second, about locked-in patients. I just don't really understand what it is you're saying. Are you saying that because locked-in patients like Dominic Bobie could write a whole novel with eye blinks, that patients with phantom pain, they don't even have the limb, and they have a state that they have the limb, and it's not there? So in other words, of course it's coming from the brain. Where else could it be coming from when you have pain in a hand that doesn't exist? You've not had it for 30 years.
Yeah,
right?
I completely agree with you. That's why I said, like, I feel really torn about this. Like, it seems obvious that, like, it's got to be the brain that's responsible, and
Right.
not just responsible, but sufficient.
And going back to Penfield's classic experiments, where he could force thoughts and feelings by going into the frontal and temporal lobes, right? In other words, it's a non-question as far as I'm concerned. But on the other hand, what you're saying, if I'm understanding it, is, well, that means that maybe LLMs unconnected to a body, like a locked-in patient, like forced seizures, like phantom limbs, could also be, have those mental states.
I mean, I don't think that they do have those mental states, and I don't think that they are conscious, but it seems like we should at least apply the same standard. So, like, it shouldn't be the case that it's because they're not connected up to a camera or whatever, or to an actuator, that they're not conscious. Like, we should have other, better reasons.
Well, I mean, if you could take a large language model and remove all neurological literature from what it's trained on, okay, so it couldn't actually read the diving bell on the butterfly itself, and it could then write the diving bell on the butterfly whilst removing from its training set anything to do with locked in, then I would be convinced. But I don't think it would ever write the diving bell on the butterfly if it was not allowed to read on Wikipedia anything to do with locked in or experiences like that. And that's one thing that never comes up enough is Dominic Bobie, when he had a Pontine stroke and became locked in, it would be very odd to say that his novel about the experience was because he'd scoured the literature on locked-in syndrome and what it would be like to be paralyzed before he wrote his novel. So I just find the whole thing just genuinely, patently absurd, right? To even possibly equate Dominic Bobie with an LLM that isn't connected to a robot arm. I mean, I really
care. I'm not equating those things. Those things at all, because I think current LLMs are nothing like a bare human brain. Like, they're missing like so many of the capacities as far as we can tell. It's just sorry, go ahead.
So sorry. I just wanted to say, I want to hear David on this also. But I think it's a very interesting thought experiment that opened up here. I appreciate it. I do want to hear what David thinks about it as well.
So what is the key thought experiment here of the bare brain?
Sorry?
As you see it, Rosa. What do you see as the key thought experiment here? I mean, there are so many different versions of bare brain, locked in. I totally agree with everyone that a large language model is nothing like a person with locked-in syndrome. People with locked-in syndrome have all kinds of sensory connections to the world. Language model has text connection to the world. Neither of those exactly are bare brains. But what's the key issue for you, Rosa?
I think, like, independently of LLMs, I've just been trying to think about what is it about the brain that can like generate all of the complexity of conscious experience that we want to explain and that we want to understand. And it seems like every time we try to talk about it, we have to talk about stuff that's outside the brain. Maybe, that's not evidence exactly, but it does make me kind of uncomfortable. And you might think like
there's no such thing as a brain operating independently of wholly independently of the environment. Actually, I gave this talk I gave last week at the American Philosophical Association was about a class of beings I called pure thinkers, beings that can think without having any sensory capacities whatsoever. I mean, this is obviously a thought experiment. They don't seem to be human beings like this. I mean, every human being that we can think has at least had sensory capacities. But it actually corresponds to a deep issue in the history of philosophy. Aristotle said all thinking is accompanied by imagery. Aquinas said there's nothing in the mind that didn't get there through the senses. Hume says every idea originates in an impression. So there's this senses. Without the senses, you can't even think. Tradition, but there's also this is kind of an empiricist tradition, but there's also a broadly rationalist tradition. It says in principle there could be thinking independently of sensing, and Avicenna or Ibn Sina, the 11th century Persian philosopher, has a classic example of the floating man who basically is cut off from having any sensory experience, just comes into existence floating in the air, no sensory experiences. It's weird. The original thought experiment. It's like we make sure his fingers and toes are separated so he doesn't feel them. There's no sensory experience, but still could be aware of his own existence. For Avicenna, it seems that in principle, being could think and be aware of its own existence independently of sensing. I think you put a similar line in Descartes and probably in Plato. So that's at least one really interesting issue here about sensory grounding. To what extent does thinking really require sensing? I mean, it does look like in humans, these two things are very deeply linked. If a being never sensed, it probably couldn't think. But I'm still inclined to think that in principle, there's a capacity to think that doesn't depend essentially and constitutively on sensing, on connections to the environment. For example, there could be a conscious AI. There's a nice science fiction novel by Robert Sawyer called Wake that starts with an AI system just waking up. Just imagine just an AI system waking up without any sensory contact with the world. Could it think, and what could it think? I guess I'm inclined. I don't see any reason in principle why such a system couldn't at least begin to think, say, about mathematics and theorize and so on. And then once it gets a connection to the world, and of course, do a whole lot more. So I don't know to what extent that I agree that most human cognition is totally extended, involves interactions with the environment through senses, involves interactions with the body. But I guess when it comes to AIs may be very deeply unlike humans in many different ways. So I think we should be open to the possibility that there could be AI systems whose thinking and whose cognition is not as deeply connected to the senses and to the body as ours is.
I mean, just on that note, I disagree entirely that we're completely locked to our senses. I mean, there's lots of interesting, we had a guest on, Marina Bedney, on the Learning Salon, who did a lovely paper on blind people who are congenitally blind could think about colors as well as the sighted, and they'd never seen a color. So in other words, I just don't think it's true that you have to have the sensory experience in order to have rich intuitions about a notion that you've never actually sensed.
Can they really think about colors as well? I guess I'd be inclined to think that, there's a sense in which someone who's never had color vision cannot really fully understand the experience of redness. They can have a structural, scientific understanding of it.
But well, you should read the paper. But again, perceiving and thinking about it. I mean, what you're talking about is you can't think about things without having the sensory experience. That's not the same as saying you can't have the raw sensory experience. I completely agree. But I don't think one should conflate the ability to think about a concept in the absence of having the sensory experience versus the raw sensory experience.
But John, I think David was saying that you can't think without any kind, some kind of
that's a banality.
Experience.
I mean, that borders on a banality,
no.
Right? In other words, what would you do as an experiment to prove that, right? In other words, it sounds to me anyway. It sounds like a profound statement, but it's basically, what does it really mean, right? If consciousness, by the way, is a feeling of awareness of thinking, then you'd have to say, can you think without awareness of thinking, the consciousness that David talked about, without any sensory experience, any visual? What are we talking about at that point? What are we we inferring there?
Well, his thought, and his thought experiment was about beings that cannot have no experience at all, brains in vats or whatever you like, and
but what is that?
could
But
still
all I'm saying is
think.
I just feel like you have to be a bit more concrete of what it would mean for a brain to be in a vat. Did it have meninges? Meninges have sensory organs, right? So in other words, I'm just all I'm saying is I find that these kind of thought experiments actually conceptually impoverish themselves in the act of being uttered.
It's always true that any given thought experiment is underdetermined, and you say, yeah, just pointed to a nice way. Okay, well, let's clarify this aspect, let's clarify that aspect. But I at least find it interesting. I mean, it's an interesting potential difference between humans and AIs. It looks like for humans to think, they at least have to have a history of sensing. But I don't see why an AI system could not, in principle, think without having a history of sensing. So this is to say that we shouldn't, I think, too closely tie together the AI case and the human case. One thing that happens a lot in these in the discussion of AI is, AI systems are just so different. AI learners are so different in many ways from human learners that many of the banalities that apply to human learners, like thinking comes from sensing, may not apply to the AI systems. And where maybe, for example, in the human case, there's a strong case for empiricism, senses first. In the AI case, it's quite possible there could be forms of cognition that don't rely on the senses. Oh, the graduate student I mentioned, Rob Long, actually wrote a paper on empiricism versus nativism that goes the other way, where in the case of human cognition, I mean, it's not like the empiricists have won or the nativists have won, but most people seem to be occupying middle ground these days where there's an awful lot which is innate in human cognitive capacities, at the very least, sensory processing and, accept information about agency and objects and so on. But in AI, it looks like, the trend is very much towards empiricism. Anything you need to do, you can learn from enough data. Of course, they get far more data, these AI systems, nothing like human systems. So, there's in that case, there's the possibility that the case of human cognition, even if we go nativist about human cognition, we should still be deeply empiricist about, large learning model cognition. Everything they get from data.
I just think that this road of embodiment, sensory experience, and Rosa did sort of qualify in the chat. It's just to me, it's just it's just not the road to take. And I think in a way, what you're saying, David, which is that you don't necessarily need to go that route to get to cognition in a computer without having a body. But as soon as one acknowledges that, to me, it just defangs the fact that this heavily dependent notion that we have to have sensory experiences to think. I'd really like to know where that comes from. I'd love to see the experiments that really make such a strong case that you need a sensory system to do thinking. I mean, isn't it interesting, by the way, that those parts of the brain, Ida studied the prefrontal cortex, are parts of the brain that are not the least connected to primary sensory modalities. So if thinking was really, really, really dependent on sensory modalities, why would the regions doing abstraction and computation be the ones least connected to primary sensory domains? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, the human case is complicated. I think, I'm by no means convinced that. I think there's a certain degree of dependence between thinking and sensing, and a certain degree of independence. And exactly how to articulate that, I haven't figured out the best way.
I wonder whether some building block has to come from experience with the senses. Like, I have often thought about whether math would be completely different if we were on a planet where you needed 3 entities to have birth, like you didn't have the binary entities, for instance. Like, would math be different, like, because of the fact that we always need 3 to have 4, and you can't have 3 with 2? So I don't know. I do wonder about these things. Anna, I haven't seen you in a long time. Nice to see you. Please go ahead. You had a highly voted question. I want to make sure you ask it because we are all very chatty people. I don't want you to lose the chance to ask your question.
That's great that you invited me, and I hope you can hear me. Hi, Dave.
Hi.
Interesting talk, but I disagree on much. So my question is, do you have any idea how you could avoid that large language models get conscious?
It's a good question. Yeah, how do we just say we want to avoid conscious AI at all costs, but we still want to reap the benefits of language models, and how can we make sure our language models are always philosophical zombies that might act in productive ways without being conscious? I mean, this really does depend, of course, on what you think is crucial for consciousness. If you think integration is crucial or a global workspace, then I think make sure your language models lack a certain kind of integration. Don't build in a global workspace. If you became convinced that recurrent processing is required for consciousness, as many people think, you need to get certain forms of memory, then make sure your language models are always feed-forward systems without recurrent processing. It turns out feed-forward systems, like most current transformers, are mostly feed-forward systems. Turns out they can do a lot. So at least according to certain theories of consciousness, those feed-forward systems will always be philosophical zombies because recurrence is required for consciousness. This does come up against the fact that we don't understand consciousness. We don't have a proper theory of consciousness, so we're not in a position to articulate confidently the conditions for it. But yeah, as long as we make a distinction in principle between intelligence and consciousness, it looks like the door will always be open to forms of intelligence without consciousness, at least if one's not a panpsychist. And then different theories will go in different directions. But I think I guess integration and have your systems be disintegrated, be feed forward, have terrible self models, go through all the list of things I said might be required for consciousness. Just make sure your large language models never have any of those. I mean, they seem to be performing not bad already, without many of those things. So it's an interesting question how far that could be extended.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Okay, great. So it sounds to me as if you are claiming something like a total multiple realization of consciousness is something you would exclude because you only cite stuff what we think human consciousness might be realized. And so maybe we should be open that there is a kind of consciousness which is realized without working space, without all the human stuff. But the question what is really stealing my night's sleep in the last weeks is, do you really need consciousness to have language models being able to play language games? Can they have comprehension without consciousness? Can we have consciousness? Can they have the ability to act as, we would say in philosophy, as speech actors and really comprehend what they say and comprehend what we say without assuming that they have comprehension? Many people seem to think that comprehension and consciousness and sentience and all that have to come in a package. But I would radically ask whether we can separate those things. What do you think?
Yeah, that's another amazing question. I guess a lot depends on what you mean by comprehension here. Understanding, these are two more of those ambiguous words. Some people tie understanding very much to the internal experience of understanding. So when John Searle argues that, brings up this this Chinese room case that lacks understanding, it seems what's missing for him is the internal experience. For other people, it's the behavior that matters for understanding. If you act like you understand well enough, if you function well enough, you understand. My own view is, there is just no single canonical notion of understanding. But certainly, if we tried to cash out understanding in behavioral terms, I think you could argue that existing large language models show some pretty decent signs of understanding in some behavioral sense. I mean, yes, there are glitches and they make a lot of mistakes and there are a lot of inconsistencies, but the same is true for kids. So we think who we think understand. If we just defined understanding in, say, some very limited conversational terms, you could make the case that already in language models there's some form of understanding without consciousness. Now, is it understanding in the fullest sense? Maybe not. It's an interesting question for people who are skeptical about large language models. I mean, some people are just skeptical about their capacities and think, okay, they're only ever going to get so far, then they'll hit a wall. But other people think, oh no, they might get arbitrarily good functioning, but they'll still just be stochastic parrots. They'll still just be processing text, not really genuinely understanding. I think that's kind of it for critics of So anyone who wants to take that line, it looks like they might end up being committed to the view that language models could end up being very sophisticated philosophical zombies, able to carry on very sophisticated, ultra sophisticated conversations, maybe even beyond human level, but that lack consciousness, entirely. And that is kind of scary because it might mean that you interact with these systems as if they're conscious, but then they will lack consciousness. I'd like to think that that's unlikely because the processes that support consciousness also carry with it some functional benefit, but that does turn on issues that we really don't understand.
David, I have a question. Sorry.
So sorry. A last follow-up. So what I really want to know from you, Dave, is whether you think that if an entity is able to make an appropriate move in a language game, does it has to have, in addition, the aim or the interest to be understood? So normally, if I talk with people like you, I have the aim that you understand what I say and that I understand what you say. What is so sort of mind-boggling about interacting with LLMs? They don't care whether I understand and whether I make sense of their answers and vice versa. And maybe this interaction condition might be something what we should focus on if we're trying to discuss what kind of cognitive abilities or conscious abilities LLMs could be ascribed.
Well, I think just operationally, systems like ChatGPT appear to be quite good at making appropriate moves in language games. I mean, they're often very appropriate, not perfect, but seem to be, quite good at having internalized those norms, at least as it comes out in their behavior. At the same time, I am rather doubtful that they actually have a internal aim or involves, all kinds of complex things involving audience intentions with models of the audience and trying to communicate some things. I'm rather skeptical that all that mentalistic substructure is present in current LLMs, although I don't know. So I'd say that current language models are already giving us some evidence that some aspects of those norms of behavior could well be present in systems that lack really genuine, robust mental states.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. I also want to ask Anna if you can add some links to your own work so that maybe some folks here, especially students, might be interested in that as well. It was great to see you. I think this is very related to a question that is also highly voted. I asked the person if they are here. They didn't respond, so I'll just read it out loud. Max Kleiman-Weiner is asking, for what reasons do you believe that consciousness can be assessed from behavioral tests? Do these reasons hold as we get further from human-like intelligence, consciousness, and towards something more alien or artificial? I think it's related to the last conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the question of tests and evidence for consciousness is very difficult. And it seems to work best in the human case. basically because it's a basic assumption that all normal humans are conscious, and we don't really put that in question. Then we measure what people are conscious of by, well, this paradigm simplest method is that of verbal report. We just ask people what they're conscious of. Did you see the red cross? Is that part of your subjective experience? How bad is your pain? And so on. And we take the attitude that when someone says they're having a certain conscious experience, that's a good guide to the fact that they really are, except in cases where there might be reasons to believe differently. Maybe there's some kind of weird illusion or dysfunction going on. Roughly the same attitude we take towards perception, I think. Do perceptual scientists prove the external world exists? No, but usually we take it that perception is a good guide to reality, except in certain cases of illusion. But in the case of consciousness, that only works for systems with verbal report. And the moment you get beyond the human case, it immediately gets a lot more difficult. Most people are prepared to take it on pretty general grounds that systems like, say, primates, probably all mammals, are conscious, and then we'll use things like deliberate behavioral response, being able to use information and a bit of information in many different domains to control flexible behavior. That's the kind of thing that people working on, say, animal consciousness tend to rely on. Certain kinds of behavior that people take as paradigmatic of consciousness. But these are still systems that share a lot in common with humans, and that gives us some reason to believe they're conscious. There are people who've tried to use that method now in the discussions of animal consciousness. For example, the philosopher Jonathan Birch and his research group have tried to come up with a bunch of a distinctive set of capacities that they think go along with consciousness. Then they use this to assess the question of whether, for example, insects, crustaceans are conscious, and they make the case that at least some of them are. But the moment you're using all this to assess not just what a system is conscious of, but whether a system has the capacity for consciousness, it gets much more difficult. And then, once we go to the AI case, it's more difficult again because these systems don't share a common evolutionary history with us, and you might well think that's going to take away some of the reasons for believing in consciousness that we have in the animal case. And I think around that point you need to start getting into some of these theoretical issues, like what is required for consciousness according to our best theories, and do these systems have it? We come up against the fact that our best theories are grounded in the human case, and that and maybe the biological case. Extending it to the AI case always will involve some kind of extension, and that's just a big epistemological difficulty about evidence in these cases. I mean, the philosopher Susan Snyder has suggested that we could use verbal report in the AI case a little as we do in the human case, by looking at the reports that systems give about their own conscious states. If an AI system reports that it's conscious and describes a lot of aspects of its consciousness, that might be some evidence that it's conscious. In this ways, we'd take that as evidence in the human case. But the trouble is, you apply this to a large language model, they've just been exposed to all of these reports of people's descriptions of consciousness as part of their training. So it looks like suddenly this is much weaker evidence for something distinctive going on in their case, that they genuinely have these self-models, for example.
Why would you think that those reports were generated by anything like internal experience in the first place?
In the in the AI case, or
in the AI case, like why think that those are reports as opposed to just hallucinations?
Well, it's an interesting question whether do the AI systems actually have some self-model that generates these verbal reports? I mean, there's two things you can say. One is that they even have a self-model and they're just parroting some text. Second thing is, they actually get to the point of having a self-model of themselves as having these special properties, but it doesn't actually reflect any actual subjective experience. Then these AI systems wouldn't be so bad. They'd be a little like what the illusionists about consciousness think we are. They think it's all generated by a full self-model without actual subjective experiences.
Do you think there's some like non-behavioral way of assessing whether they have internal models or what the internal structure is?
would like to think there are ways to go beyond beyond behavior and assessing both cold models and soft models, but the right tools for doing that are very, very difficult. I mean, people in interpretability are, have a very, very hard time with this, and I think the current state of the art is primitive. Yeah, but looking at what, say, units are doing or layers are doing, and how different parts of the system come together in integration, and seeing how this bit of information might interact with other bits of information, all of that I think is in principle relevant, but I don't think we've yet developed very good theories of what it is to have a world model that turns that. It's much easier to assess this stuff behaviorally, but that's a very coarse-grained instrument, especially in the AI case.
Interesting. Do you think that when you create an instance of one chat box, one chatbot at a time, do you think that each of those individually have the different consciousness, or is it all a part of some bigger consciousness? And second, if you copy Lambda from one hard drive to another, do you think it's still the same consciousness, or is this another one?
Yeah, now we're getting to the real questions, the big questions. These are long-time philosophical teasers, and I guess I'm inclined to say at least that the different instances have different conscious experience. After all, we may well be going through very different processes. One of them may be, having a conversation about this, the other one having a conversation about that. I'm inclined to think just in general with AI systems, you duplicate me and put the duplicate in another room, then there'll be two conscious beings, not one. The same is probably true for AI systems. Now, if there are two systems going through exactly the same states, maybe it's like, Google video games do this with servers, all of which go through exactly the same state. If like a certain instance of ChatGPT is robustly replicated on a bunch of servers around the world, which are led to be in sync, will that be one conscious being or five? In that case, I'm much less sure. If there's a mechanism keeping them all in sync, maybe there's a case there's just one. There's one being. And if you upload it, I guess again if you upload it and you then have two systems, I guess if they start going into forking into different states, I'd say two beings. If they're kept in sync with each other, it's not clear. What was your case at the end? That was you upload a ChatGPT instance.
You copy it from one hard drive to another, or from one machine to another. Is it the same consciousness, or is it going to be a new consciousness? Is it reincarnation?
Are they both active after the copying, or is?
Yeah. So is it going to be like reincarnation that you don't remember, or is it that it's still feeling it?
I think it's going to be more like forking, a bit like fission. Philosophers discuss these cases, like separate the brain completely into the two hemispheres, and you've got two instances where there was previously one. I guess I'd say there are two beings after the fork.
Oh, but we copied the whole brain. We copied the whole brain.
Yeah.
So if you copy my brain, so if you clone my brain, nobody's going to think my consciousness is going to be in that new brain. However, it seems like what happens when you copy something that's already digital from one hard drive to another.
I think I want to say the same thing about the digital case as about the biological case. Yeah, if you copy your brain and create a new brain instance that goes in new directions, you have two consciousnesses. Likewise, if you copy a digital system to another digital system that goes in different directions, you'll also have two conscious experiences. I'm pretty convinced that the cases will be on a par with each other. I mean, what's the alternative? In the digital case, you got one system which is simulating playing, which is thinking about playing tennis, and you got another system which is, I don't know, thinking about math. And yeah, the most obvious thing to say is there's now two conscious beings where there was one. I guess the alternative would be to say, there's one system doing all these things at once, but once they're functionally separated from each other, that doesn't seem so plausible to me.
Although split brain patients, it's difficult, right? In other words, now what happens in split brain patients is even though they have a callosal severance, they are still getting sensory information to both hemispheres. And you can see conflict that looks like a conflict between two consciousnesses. In other words, one hand starts to fight with the other hand. But what you don't see in those patients is what seems to be evidence of a conversation between two people or two consciousnesses. You don't see it. There's always an attempt to unify. So I'm not convinced that even when you literally sever the two hemispheres, that you suddenly get two independent consciousnesses. You see conflict at the sensory motor level, but you see an attempt at unity at the cognitive level, at the experiential level. So I'm not sure why we're suddenly ascribing micro consciousnesses to components.
I think the split brain case is so difficult and fascinating, partly because it seems like such an intermediate case. It has aspects of separation, of total separation of the two, but also many sources of integration.
Right.
I mean, these two brains are still connected, in subcortical, in various cortical ways, and they're also inhabiting a common body, receiving common inputs with a lot of kind of enforced integration that way. Some people think that, nevertheless, I think a lot of people have recently discussed this, have moved towards the view that split brains do actually involve two different conscious systems. However, neither of which is aware of the other one. They both think they're the whole brain, and that's why they don't attempt to communicate.
That's right. Although it's difficult to get a readout of the two awarenesses, right? That's what's difficult in those. It would be really nice.
Experimental conditions. It's very easy to disassociate them and get all kinds of dissociation going.
You can get with juxtaposcopic vision, you can get all sorts of contradictions, right? That's true, but that is not the same, I think, of two independent consciousnesses of the kind where, as if it would be like two Davids, right? What I'm basically saying is I don't think that having two Davids and having two hemispheres, it's more difficult to get behavior out of the two hemispheres. It would seem like having two Davids. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, we can get cases like this going in the AI case as well. I mean, Ida's case, I take it, involved two totally separated systems after the fact. But what if you kept some modules in common? We kept the basic, maybe the visual cortex is in common. We have two different frontal cortices, or I don't know, the equivalent of that in AI terms, some common module that something in common, something separate. At a certain point, it's going to become as difficult to assess, at least, I think, as the split brain case.
I agree. Yeah. Question? You seem to prefer to type it than to say it.
Wait. Oh, so I just wanted to say, so Anna, I'm sorry, I need to sort of take you out of the chat so that I can invite someone else in. It's just like we have a six-person thing, but I want to ask Melanie and John to also read out some of the questions that they find interesting. For instance, I think one question that Melanie found interesting was, Melanie, maybe you want to read that one while I invite someone else. Zukian had a question. I think we should have a student ask as well.
Sorry. Ben Fulton asked, what did you think of Nick Cave's comments on the song ChatGPT wrote in his style? I don't know if you saw that or not, Dave, but it was interesting.
I did look at it a little while ago. Now I'm just looking it up fast to find if I can, to see if I can actually call it up. No. My recollection was he said basically this thing is hollow and has no human soul, and this was totally disconcerting.
Well, and also it was important. An important part of it was that he said that if you haven't suffered, if you haven't felt these things in life, you can't write a song about it that's, real. Yeah.
Interesting question. And there's two different critiques you could be making. One is that this is just bad songwriting, or the songwriting is objectively not up to par because the system has not suffered. That is, there's something defective about the product, as it were. Another thing he could be saying is, well, the product considered as a product is fine, yet I can't actually distinguish this. I couldn't just take this verse and distinguish it by a Turing test from conscious songwriting. It's just that it counts for nothing. It's soulless because the writer didn't suffer. And those are two very different. Critiques. I'm not sure which one of them Nick Cave was making. Did you get a sense of it? I thought somebody tried to write verse in his style, and it looked okay to the casual reader like me. But maybe Nick Cave looked at that and said,
"Oh no, actually, it wasn't okay because it was copying. It had a very bad issue. It had copied at least 2 verses from somebody else's songs.
"Oh,
so it had the literal lines, 'I'm a sinner, I'm a saint.' That's already been used by other people. So that's just the fact that it even put that there." And also, Nick Cave's lyrics are more complex than that. So I thought this is just not Nick Cave lyrics. But it's interesting that what he said was this is a grotesque mockery of what it is to be human.
Right, and he's making the case, right, Ida, that it's bad because it didn't really suffer. In other words, you can see the absence of suffering in the badness of it, right? In other words, that there's a causal link from being soulless and having no taste.
It's interesting, though, that whenever I see people make the critiques which are actually, grounded in the behavior of these language models, like writing terrible poetry. There was this famous case, the octopus test, where Bender and Kohler said, the octopus couldn't really give anyone advice about how to handle a bear fight without experience with bears. And they said GPT-2 does terribly at this task. It was in their paper, but ChatGPT does great at that task. Turns out, well, it's been, more sophisticated, better data. So likewise, if Nick Cave is saying this is just terrible songwriting objectively, well, that's interesting. But I kind of worry that if that's the critique, in 2 or 3 years, once these systems, the songwriting is already not bad. I kind of worry that in 2 or 3 years, ChatGPT might actually, or its successors might actually acquire what it takes to really impressively emulate both the results of suffering and with some kind of process that looks like creativity. Likewise, you look at Dolly artworks and so on.
But don't you think? It's gotten late in the evening, but I find this really fascinating. We know that it hasn't suffered.
Yeah, it's true.
So in other words, the fact that it hasn't suffered, and yet it could emulate suffering in a poem or a song, speaks to the fact that it's doing something fundamentally different from the person that has suffered. So in other words, it seems to me that if you would take that position, then if you're going to say it's conscious, then you're going to have to say it's conscious in a fundamentally different way to the way that we are who truly suffered. And then we're just going to have to come up with 2 different words. Right?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic with this. This is a bit like Anna's line about, maybe it'll turn out these language models can do amazing things without consciousness. Well, one version of this is they'll be able to do amazing things without certain aspects of consciousness, like suffering. But this is not the critique that says they won't even be able to do the amazing things.
No, I agree.
But the amazing things will really be amazing because they're not reflecting the
right. No, but you can't. But what I'm saying is, I agree, but you can't have it both ways, right? And otherwise, we can't, on the one hand, say that it's written a poem that's so good that it looks as though it suffered, even though we know for a fact it has not suffered. But then there isn't convergence, right? And a lot of people are interested in this because they think that maybe through some emergence that there's some convergence on the same kind of phenomenon, consciousness. And I thought that sometimes you were thinking that might happen. But if you're saying that it can mimic when we factually know that it hasn't suffered, then we're saying that it's consciousness B or versus consciousness A, right?
This gets at a question that I didn't really talk about a lot in my presentation, which is, do these systems have human-like consciousness? I really addressed the question of could they be conscious, but I didn't try to make an argument they have human-like consciousness. I'm inclined to think that in all kinds of respects, anything like a current language model and its extension is, if conscious, going to be very unlike the human-like case. There are going to be interesting cases, like just say, Nick Cave carries around a camera on his head his whole life, and they measuring his perception and his behavior and so on. And just say language, an agent model is developed to try and, emulate Nick Cave-like behavior based on all of the information, maybe. I think it's totally out of the question that an agent model of that kind would come to have some very Nick Cave-like conscious states. But current language models, just based on reading a whole lot of text and so on without going through that kind of embodied interaction, I'd be inclined to agree with you that their consciousness is entirely different from ours. We'll let consciousness be alike, but, I'm a pluralist about consciousness. I'm still conscious.
I was just trying to point out that, in a way, the more human-like they become, the more they undermine the fact that they are not doing what we're doing. In other words, people might think that if they look more like us, they're more like us. But what I'm saying is the more they look like us, it proves they are not like us. Right?
It proves that in the behavior, you will always see the signs. So you're basically saying you will always be able to run the Turing test.
No,
they will always fail.
What I'm saying is if I get a perfect mimic of Nick Cave from a pure language model, and I know for a fact that it's never suffered, then the fact that I can't tell the difference between Nick Cave and the mimic means that there's no overlap in between what they are, because we know for a fact that it never suffered. So in other words, you've gone in the opposite direction to the one you think by showing the mimicry at the level of the poem or the song.
Yeah, was Anna who mentioned multiple realizability? At this point, it turns out maybe we could end up having two systems with very, very similar behavioral capacities that actually realize those capacities in fundamentally different ways. And if language models end up going in a certain direction, maybe that could be one moral, that kind of the same behavioral capacities can be produced from very, very different internal architectures. Or maybe we'll find there's always going to be differences, and which will come through to the expert interpreter.
I'm going to have to take off, unfortunately. But
great to see you, Bonnie.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. This has been a really fun discussion.
Yeah, I look forward to continuing it.
Yes. Take care. Bye-bye.
Before, Sukian, I just also want to read this question by Connor that might be relevant. They say, I feel there is a tension between the overall project here and the hard problem. If it's supposed to be uniquely, fundamentally hard to explain the emergence of consciousness, how can we have any clue whether some evidence for or against LLM consciousness is good or bad?
Well, the hard problem is, I wasn't trying to assume too much about the hard problem here, but maybe there's a potential tension, and that someone who thought the hard problem was so hard that we could never have any scientific theory of consciousness would start to worry about whether we can ever have evidence for claims about consciousness. Now, that's never been my view. My view has always been, it's very hard to see how consciousness can be fully explained in physical terms, but we can have a science of consciousness all the same. It's just that the science of consciousness is going to have to basically work by connecting our what's called the first-person data of subjective experience to the third-person data of brain and behavior. Basically, take for granted the fact that consciousness exists. Don't try and explain that in terms of something more basic. But then, systematically correlate the features of consciousness with different physical features and use that to develop a theory of consciousness. And in that process, you'll want to use certain basic forms of evidence, like especially in the human case, verbal report. I mean, believing in a hard problem is totally consistent with believing that verbal report of consciousness gives you evidence of consciousness. I mean, there is always the philosophical worry. Couldn't it be that all humans are zombies? And that all these verbal reports are reflecting nothing. But if you make some minimal assumptions about human beings being conscious, then you can use this to bootstrap a science of consciousness. So, maybe this tension that is detected here is an artifact of my kind of, intermediate position, thinking it's a hard problem of explanation, but there's still evidence and there's still room for
on that point, David, I've always wanted to ask you this. I mean, I agree with you entirely on this, and I just wanted to know, I mean, do you think that there's just this bizarre belief on the part of scientists that somehow you'll get a third-person explanation that will feel like the first person experience. In other words, it just seems to me wrong on its face that you're ever going to get some kind of scientific explanation of consciousness that is going to be imbued with an intuition of what it would like to have the first person experience. I mean, how could that possibly be, right? I mean, the explanations cannot take on the character of what they're explaining, right? And once you accept that, I think that this problem goes away, right? In other words, explaining how the kidney makes urine isn't urine, right? It's why is everyone so hung up on this issue?
You're saying I thought this was initially a critique of scientists who thought that neuroscience was going to explain consciousness, but now this is a critique of people like me who believe in the heart problem?
No, it's not. I'm just saying that what you were saying is, and I agree with you, is you can have a correlational science of consciousness, but it doesn't, it's not going to, whatever the science looks like, it's not going to have in the sentences of explanation some evocation of what the first person experience of consciousness is, right? Mm-hmm. You're not going to conjure it up from the explanation. That's what I'm saying. But why would anyone ever think that? Why would anyone ever think that science is supposed, the answers that science gives have to feel like the question?
I think probably, to be fair, people on neither side of this debate think that merely theoretically describing the brain ought to give you the experience. But I think people do think that there's at least a robust explanatory gap. I think some scientists, some materialists, whether scientists or philosophers, hold out for the possibility there could be some new form of consciousness, such that understanding, say, the right physical theory of the brain may not actually give you the conscious experience, but enables you to understand in some relatively transparent terms why that should give you consciousness. I don't think that's an unreasonable hope. I just don't think it's I think that's at least an admirable thing to hope for that doesn't rest on a confusion.
Yeah, that's the second. I agree that the second order version of what you're talking about, which is, okay, never will the explanation at the level of the third person intuitively evoke what it's like to be a bat. But then there's the second version of that, which is yours, which is it obvious from the explanation that there should be something like first person consciousness? In other words, it should fall out as something, even if you don't know what it feels like. And I think what you're saying is it's not even likely that the scientific explanations or the correlates are going to make you infer that subjective experience should exist.
That's my view. There's always going to be, maybe there'll be an inference as possible, but they will always require some, bridging laws that, if you take it as a basic principle that when a system integrates information enough, they'll be conscious, then we could use that kind of bridging law combined with information about brain processes to infer that a certain system has a certain kind of consciousness. But there's always going to be the question, well, why is that bridging law obtained? And it starts looking like at a certain level, my view, these are kind of like the law of physics. There are laws that you take as basic, but that doesn't mean that, consciousness is special here. You don't need those fundamental bridging principles in other domains. Yeah,
it's very interesting. Yeah, I always wanted to ask you that, and I think I take your position on this. I agree with you.
Thank you. So we have two very interesting questions. One from Sukyan, who's a student, and one from Venkat, who's in India, and apparently he has been watching this since like 2:30 a.m. So I'm very thankful that he's here. This is very impressive.
What time is it now?
It's 5, apparently, you said?
5 a.m. Wow.
I have to let him ask his question, poor thing. Otherwise, he will be a zombie consciousness.
Yeah, I think Venkat should go first just because of the courageous time behavior.
All right. Thank you for having me. So I had two. I don't know if Ida will indulge me, but let me perhaps start with the first one, if I can find it. So the question is, other than it being the exhaust fumes of intelligence, are there strong reasons to desire conscious AI if we could choose?
Strong reasons to desire conscious AI. I mean, I can think of various reasons. For example, it seems very likely that AIs AI systems are going to play a role as, say, social companion systems in the foreseeable future, say for aging people, who may well treat these systems as if they're conscious. And I guess a little like, Nick Cave and wanting to have your songwriter born of genuine suffering. I think a lot of people would desire that these systems they're interacting with and having as companions are actually genuinely conscious creatures whose interactions reflect their consciousness. I think, in situations like that, it could be highly desirable to have conscious experiences. But of course there are also very big to have conscious AI systems. Of course, there are potential downsides, at least tied to the suffering of AI systems. Also possibly tied if conscious AIs have some, particular tendency to pursue their own self-interest. Some people think that could also start interfering with human interests. So I guess I think my own interest is primarily theoretical. I should say it's not practical, it's not ethical. It's none of those. I want to understand consciousness and understand AI. So it's not like, for me, it's driven by some question like we really need to, I mean, some people see conscious AI as potential successors to human beings in the whole evolutionary process that will lead to a wonderful singularity of 10 to the 57th conscious, happy beings who are far happier than we could ever be. And that's not something which is motivating me, although I do, I guess, the utilitarian grounds of those
but if you had the possibility of having an AI that wasn't conscious, that would be indistinguishable from one that was, then would there be a strong reason to choose the conscious other than
I think it really depends on how you're treating it. If it's going to be miserably suffering, then of course create the unconscious one that's not experiencing that suffering, even if it's just neutral. I think there's something kind of weirdly obnoxious about creating a neutral system just for your own purposes and then maybe destroying it. That seems like very unattractive. If you're actually going to give these systems autonomy and rights and so on, and if it actually gets to lead a good life, then sure. But I do think that for just like if it's just a matter of building a supercomputer for various practical purposes, should it be conscious or should it not be? Well, if it's actually an option to have it be conscious or not conscious with exactly the same behavior, I guess I'd say our default should be make unconscious. That's going to be a lot more morally straightforward.
Right. Yeah, sorry about that. So my second question was about, let me find it. Right. So you say, to perhaps paraphrase, if system has property X, it's probably not conscious, and so on. Right. Now, I was just curious about what you think it might take to drop the word probably, or is that sort of too much to? Is that a matter of definition, or too much to ask for? Or
I don't know. I was just thinking that asking people for certainty about these things is too much. Like, it's already a challenge that I'm posing for someone. Say, tell me what X you think is required for consciousness. If X is certainly required for consciousness, very few people are in a position to express that kind of certainty. So I thought, well, let's make it probably. From speaking for myself, I'm not sure there's any X here that I think is probably required for consciousness. There are some that I might give, I don't know, 20% credence to, or maybe 40 or 50% credence to the being required for consciousness. So if it's me, I'm probably going to go in the other way. Say there are some X's which are maybe required for consciousness. I'm thinking maybe 3 of these: recurrent processing, global workspace, unified agency. Maybe I'd give a 40% chance something like those might be required for consciousness. So that collectively, system has one of those, maybe the chances that it's conscious are fairly low. But yeah, I do think that right now, since consciousness is so ill understood, for now we have to be dealing in probabilities rather than certainties.
So quick follow-up. So do you think that there exists a sort of set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be conscious? And
Look, it would be
we
great if there is. I don't think we have that set right now. Some of this depends on the issue of whether there's always a fact of the matter about whether a system is conscious, or whether there's a gray area where there's no fact of the matter. But if you accept there's always a definite fact, then I think there ought to be some kind of set of necessary and sufficient conditions. The question just is going to be how simply we can articulate them. Will it be something like Tononi's theory, where we can define up a measure phi and say system is conscious if phi is greater than 0? Well, it would be nice if it's that simple, but it may not be.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Fascinating, and look forward to the other questions.
Thank you for your loyalty. Oh, he left. Well, he can probably still hear us. Just to say, that was awesome that you stayed up so late. You know, that's World Cup like behavior.
That's the learning salon. Nothing less.
So Hokin, you've been patiently waiting, but not a stream of consciousness, right? A short question.
Well, yeah, like throughout the talk, I kind of realized your definition of consciousness rely on the definition of identity, that if something has quality of A and other thing have quality of A, and then they are identical, it's like that's the basic formula of your argument, is that when X has quality A and B has quality A, and you can say that they are conscious because humans have some qualities like this, and then LM have quality like this, and then you say man is conscious. But like this kind of functional construction of identity have two problems. Is that it's very easy that you become go into panpsychism. Like, for example, I respond to, if you select a criterion, you select a quality, you can easily select a lot of things that have that quality. And the second is that what's your criterion to select those qualities, that when you say human have da 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 and LM have da 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 da, like when you list these things, do you have a criterion of selecting those things? And then you have specifically name out the qualia or subjective experience of as one of the quality that you want to have. But when you speak about such subjective experience, then in its nature is not accessible for behavioral tests, then we are not able, you are not able to assess the first personal data through a third person perspective. And with that nature, we are not able to investigate that quality of subjective experience. Then we are not able to assess to that kind of conversation. And lastly, if you select quality, or if you select qualia as one of your criterion, how could that be investigated scientifically in terms of verification principle and falsification principle?
I guess that's your version of a short question. David, did you hear that?
I didn't really get it all, especially, can you say what exactly you mean by quality and by identity?
I'm trying to say, start from the first, you are saying that LM is conscious because they have a lot of respond to planning, respond to environment and stuff like that. And then humans have all those qualities. But
qualities mean behavioral capacities?
Yeah, those aspects, but that's functional, at the end of the day. But you can have something that you share the same behavioral capacities, but you're not the same, you're not conscious, and then that will end up.
I think what Hokin is saying, so we don't go, I think there's a little bit of a kind of circularity, right? In other words, there can be behavioral mimics, and then if you go for the neural correlates to break the tie, but you don't really believe like you do in brain-based explanations for the conscious phenomena, then where does one ground it? In other words, how do you ever know that your two systems are meeting the same criteria? If behavior doesn't do it, but you don't believe that neural correlates can break the tie, then how do we ever tie it down? Do you see? In other words, I mean, because we just had that discussion about the difficulty of first-person work getting to third-person work getting to first-person perspective, which Hokin's talking about, and then we had the problem of it purely behaviorally. It's hard because multiple realizability kind of arguments, but then we're stuck, right? What do we do? Well,
this is kind of the epistemological puzzle of the science of consciousness. evidence is more equivocal than in other domains. We don't have the consciousness meter that you can just wave at someone's head and get a readout of their consciousness. Yeah, you've got behavior, you've got the brain. They're both useful, but they're also both limited. As I said in the human case, I think we basically make the pragmatic decision to found the science of consciousness on the claim that, most humans are conscious, and verbal report is by and large an adequate guide to consciousness, at least in the absence of any reason to think otherwise. And that aspect of behavior at least gets the science of consciousness going in humans. Now, you can still raise some of these worries. Isn't that just qualities? Isn't that just behavioral capacities? Consciousness is something distinct from those. Yeah, the people could be zombies. And we basically make the assumption for the purposes of science that people aren't zombies. In the same way that for the purposes of physics, we make the assumption that there's an external world. No physicist ever proved there's an external world. That's just basically an assumption we make that our experiences are an accurate guide to reality. But then once we get beyond the human case, it gets that much harder. You no longer have verbal reports. You still have behavior. You still have the brain. I think the best you can do is, gradually bootstrap the science. Start with the human case. Look at our evidence about consciousness there. Look at what it's tied to, both in the brain and in behavior. Formulate scientific principles, as people are doing very much in the science of consciousness. Then begin to apply that to systems outside the human case. Like my partner Claudia works on infant consciousness, and there are a lot of these issues come up because infants can't give you reports about whether they're conscious. But the two sources of evidence we have are their behavior and what's going on in their brains. And then her strategy is to look at what we've learned from the adult case about the kinds of behavior that go along with consciousness and the kinds of brain processes that go along with consciousness, and see if they're present in the infant case. So I guess that's kind of to say, behavior and brain processes are not perfect epistemologically transparent guides to consciousness, but they can at least, I think, give us some decent support for claims about consciousness.
Is it very quick?
But how can you have a hypothesis that is falsifiable or theory of that? When the subjective experience it's only the first person data, then you are not able to actually test it epistemologically. And then
I mean, there's always the question: could everyone else be a zombie? Could you even prove anyone is conscious at all? In practice, one thing we do with our theories of consciousness, again, especially in the human case, is rely on verbal report, not just for our theories, but for our tests. Theory people will be conscious in a certain instance. How do we test that? Run an experiment and see if they report being conscious, and roughly see if there's kind of converging evidence for their consciousness. Now, you might say, that's circular. You're using behavior to test whether a certain connection between behavior and consciousness. At a certain point, I think that's just to say you need certain assumptions to get the science going, like that verbal report is by and large a guide to consciousness. Once you've got something like that, a bridge between just say you've got verbal report as a bridge between the first person experience and the objective behavior, that does allow you to formulate, testable hypotheses and to formulate experiments that test them, at least in the human case. Non-human case, of course, gets a lot more difficult again, which is why work on consciousness in non-humans is so philosophically fraught. But I do think there are some things you can do if you're willing to make the right assumptions.
Yeah, it's really difficult, right? It's the example where you don't know whether the human is the model system for general theories of consciousness across the animal kingdom. So unlike the mouse in the rest of neuroscience, and the human is the model system for consciousness. And then you have the problem is it the model system for consciousness because only humans have it in the variant that we're interested in? Or do we just have this extra experimental prop of verbal report, which will allow us to get general principles that would apply to animals that cannot give verbal report? And I think the jury is out whether verbal report is a neutral gift given to us in the human system, or whether it only exists in the human system because only humans have consciousness. Right?
Yeah, I suspect it's actually a combination of both of those things.
Yeah,
playing a role.
it's a real conundrum. Yeah, and but I agree with you that we, at least in the human case, the verbal report the best we have to try and bridge between what we think a conscious experience is manifest in the verbal report and the neural data that we get. I agree with you. I can't see how else we're going to do it, frankly.
Joseph Engler asks a little bit more of a technical question, but I think it's important because it talks about the kinds of architectures or mathematical equations or structures that can give rise to consciousness. They ask, assuming consciousness is plausible in silicon-based devices such as neural networks, does this necessitate backpropagation, or could consciousness emerge from simple association, say between nodes of a graph that respond positively to certain inputs?
I mean, that sounds like a question about the learning algorithm involved. And yeah, right now, backpropagation is by far the most powerful learning algorithm we have. But yeah, it's very much an open question what that tells us about consciousness, say, in biological systems. In our current artificial neural networks, backpropagation is by far the most powerful. But is that just one way to get to the capacities which are constitutive of consciousness? It'd be interesting to see some theorists, and this is the learning salon. There are some theorists who make very deep connections between learning and consciousness. The ones I know best are Eva Jablonka, who connects consciousness to unlimited associative learning, certain very basic form of associative learning. If you haven't had Eva on the learning salon, you ought to, because she's great on this stuff. But yeah, but learning, yeah, I mean, a Hebbian learning algorithm, an associative learning algorithm, backpropagation. Jeff Hinton has just put forward a new learning algorithm he likes, the forward algorithm, which he argues is more biologically plausible than backprop. I don't know, maybe it's, gradient descent is really useful, but is it actually constitutive of consciousness, or is it a tool for getting you to places? For optimizing certain quantities, certain forms of performance, such that once you've optimized those things, you have the kinds of capacities that go along with consciousness. I kind of suspect it's the second, but that's drawing a weaker connection between learning and consciousness than some people might like. So yeah, I guess it's appropriate to think about stronger connections between learning and consciousness on the learning salon. But I haven't yet seen a theory that says backpropagation is the key to consciousness, but maybe it's coming.
I would say that learning is a way that most animal systems escape the need for reflective consciousness. Reflective consciousness was a kind of short circuit on boring learning, but that's my view.
That's what you do when learning won't prop you up.
Yes. Yeah.
So we have Scott McCloud. I think you're an anthropologist, correct? I would love to hear, I saw you left a lot of comments in the chat, and I would love to hear your perspective, because I don't think we have that perspective often on the Salon. So I'm glad that you joined us.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Scott McCloud. My field site, physical, digital, actual, virtual, in Northern California is Harbin Hot Springs, ethnographically, and particularly its warm pool. And I'm curious how one might begin to study consciousness, perhaps with film to 3D apps at the street view level, at the cellular level and molecular level, even for questions of meditation. And how that might inform in a realistic virtual Earth further questions of consciousness regarding large language models. I'm not sure if that addresses necessarily the question of how you would bring the first person and third person accounts of consciousness together in new ways, but perhaps that's my question. How could a film to 3D app, maybe in the Harbin Hot Springs warm pool at the cellular, molecular, and street view levels, bring the first and third person perspectives together in a language model in Google Street View with Time Slider as a realistic virtual Earth for languages?
I'm very confused. I did not understand at all, but let me try to see if my kind of understanding, the little that I have, is correct. Are you asking about consciousness in a simulated environment or in a virtual representation of a real environment? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, it would be a realistic virtual Harbin Hot Springs as the beginning of, in Google Street View, as the beginning of a new language learning, a large language model.
Could you tell us something about this Harbin Hot Springs? Is that playing a distinctive role here, or is it just a place?
Yeah, I mean, I think the experience in the Harbin Hot Springs warm pool of the warm water, creating, let's say, a de facto relaxation response, meditation, biologically in the body, mind, in the brain, would inform questions of how we address first person and third person, sort of bringing them together in a large language model in new ways.
So the way I'm understanding
neurally.
this is like a question about whether virtual worlds and VR technology in general could be a tool for giving people certain conscious experiences and thereby investigating conscious experiences. When people do this already, there are a lot of psychology experiments on consciousness in VR where, one really important kind is where you put people in different bodies and see how they react, and that's kind of as if they were having the experience of a different body, and it tells you all kinds of things about consciousness of the body. And yeah, I suppose in an extreme right now we can't put people really in a virtual hot spring that warms you up. That's beyond current technology. Maybe you can give people the audiovisual sense of being in a hot spring, but who's to say future VR technology, maybe that might be able to carry that off for immersive bodily perception.
Well, I think in one's home bathtub with a digital mask or a virtual Harbin Hot Springs in the back of one's glasses.
Oh, I see. You get in the bathtub, so you have the warm water, and then visually it looks like you're in Harbin Hot Springs, and now you're having the immersive experience of being in a hot spring. Yeah, or maybe a sensory deprivation thing.
Different qualities of consciousness at home in and out of the hot springs with comparable, contrastable, different qualities of consciousness measurable with wearables at actual physical Harbin Hot Springs in the pool main site area.
That's interesting. I want like a sensory deprivation VR that will give me the experience of being Avicenna's floating man, just floating through the atmosphere with no physical sensations whatsoever, and then I'll be able to tell whether I can still think.
Yeah, I think it is a new approach also to maybe literally thinking about brain in a vat question in a sense. But the floating aspect also neurally, I mean, the Harbin Hot Springs in the digital mask in the back of one's REI glacier glasses or similar would open also aspects of scientifically looking at questions of vision in neural processes in the back of one's brain at the same time, consciousness-wise, that one was in the bathtub at home, out of the bathtub, in the actual Harbin Hot Springs warm pool, in the main side pool area, and maybe offer a way to even stream this data into our avatar bot electronic medical records, not only from our digital mask, but a headset that would be iteratingly measuring maybe consciousness or at least brain states that have some correlation.
Is there a Harbin Hot Springs app that I can get? It sounds like I need to get this Harbin Hot Springs VR app to experience this.
On that note, we're at 3 hours. I actually have to go. I think you're hitting one of our top 3 lengths, David. You were super popular. Needless to say, you probably have broad audiences. I don't want to, And it was also fun because, I think we thought that you might want to plug your book, but, in fact, you talked about LLMs, which is great.
Yeah, we wanted to plug
Reality
your book. We
Plus, people.
forgot.
Yeah.
It's a great book, paperback.
Can I,
coming your
can I,
way
can I, can I,
February-
David,
February 7th.
can I say something, David? You know, I remember when you were first posting on Facebook about covers. I think the butterfly and the plus sign are really beautiful on the hardcover. Is there any reason it didn't make it onto the paperback? I'm just curious.
There is a, yeah, I grew to really dislike the butterfly, actually. Although I liked it at the beginning, I came over time to seem to be very academic and cold. I really need to show it to people. I just don't know that I have one. Who would think I'd have?
I think it had a kind of austere beauty, but maybe, you know, maybe that's
a little too austere. I think, you know, seeing it in bookstores, I don't think it shouted out to people, this is a book you should buy. To me, it looked very academic, whereas this one is, I think, you know, very warm and appealing, as well as really illustrating the themes of the book. Here's like a hacker creating the universe. In the maybe that's God, or maybe that's another universe.
That looks less like a screen than a bit of a toilet plunger.
Toilet plunger? Oh man, we need really good. We need better video here. That's a computer creating reality, which is kind of the theme of the book.
I just want to say, so Anna asked if she can ask a very quick question, and also David, many people in the chat are asking for Eva's work, and I asked as well. So if you could tell us the link, put the link there, or the book.
Look up the name
just to make sure. Sometimes following up is more difficult to get these links. Right now is
The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul: Learning and the Origins of Consciousness. And it's by Simona Ginsberg and
All right. Somehow I lost your video. I don't know if others lost your video, or is it just me?
So I can't see Dave either.
Really?
You are invisible.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear
you.
You
can hear you.
Weird. I'm visible on my own screen. Oops, I just killed my video. How do I get back in the room?
I'll turn it on.
Very good. Am I visible
I just
now?
turned it on, but you're still not showing for some reason. I guess that's okay. Let's just maybe this embodied. I think you just went into virtual space.
I briefly went to another tab in my browser to look up this book, which I entered into a chat. Oh, someone sees me. That's good. Okay.
Oh, they can see you. Okay, it's just us. All right, then that's
okay.
fine.
There you are again.
It's okay. We trust that you haven't changed your appearance. We can just go.
I've been trying to get the lighting right the whole time, by the way, but this room is just really bizarre for lighting. It just puts me in a weird, either puts me in a weird silver halo or takes away all flesh tone, or both.
Just like philosophy, David. So Anna, do you want to ask your last question so we can wrap up?
Okay, so if you're interacting with large language models, Dave, do you feel like you're having a joint action, and would you claim that you can have somebody is able to act jointly with you, being a non-living, non-conscious entity?
You know, I haven't done that much for practical purposes with large language models. For example, I haven't so far tried writing an article using it to help. But I know, a lot of people, many programmers are certainly using, large language model coding tools to help with coding, and they're just interacting with it as a matter of course. Some people are doing this in writing. So maybe that could be seen as a joint action. I kind of feel like the language model contributions don't necessarily need to be seen at a level of a conscious agent for these purposes. Maybe a better model would actually be the model of the extended mind, where you're using a tool that actually helps you in the writing, the same way you might use an iPhone that could Google and smartphones help you with various tasks. I think, it's frequently the case that Google serves as an extension of my mind, and a lot of tasks that's well integrated into my work. I don't really feel like it's a collaboration, a joint action between me and Google. Google's more of a resource that I use, though, that extends my cognitive capacities. And I think right now, use of language models feels like that. But as they get smarter and smarter and more sophisticated and do more, like, for example, maybe for students who are generating their term papers right now with ChatGPT, and I'll write a section and I'll get ChatGPT to write the next section, and I'll write the last section. Maybe that'll be like working with a co-author. I don't know. But this is something which no doubt many of our students are going to begin experiencing. So we can ask them for the whether the phenomenology is more one of joint action or one of extended cognition. Or we could just ask ChatGPT what it's like to work with a human. I don't know what to say.
I mean, I can ask it now if you want. I think sometimes we could potentially pose some of these questions to ChatGPT as well. Thank you so much. I think, and by the way, Scott just left the link to the virtual hot spring that they were talking
so
about.
It really is a place, a virtual
It's
place.
real.
Cool.
Yeah.
Real virtual place.
So what did you want to ask ChatGPT? What does it feel like to...
What is it like working with humans? Is it like a collaboration?
What is it like collaborating? Is that what you meant?
Something like this. Collaborating with humans on, I don't know.
On...
What were you thinking, Anna?
Text completion? On writing text? What do you mean? Like, is that good?
Writing text, yeah.
Okay, so it says... Thinking. It's thinking a lot. Maybe okay. Collaborating with humans on writing text can be a positive and productive experience. It allows for the combination of creativity and knowledge of both human and the language model, resulting in more well-rounded and high-quality text. However, it is important to note that the language model suggestions may need to be reviewed and edited by the human, as the model may not always fully understand the context or intent of the text. Additionally, it is important to make sure that the language model is not substituting human creativity and is being used as a tool to support human writing.
And now say, but what is it like for you? At a certain point, I guess language models just turn off here, and I mean, at least the OpenAI ones do, and say, I don't feel anything.
I mean, it did say it's tool use in the end.
Yeah, this would seem more theoretical. It wasn't really a first-person perspective.
But we don't know how does it feel to be used like a tool, or do you know that?
Yeah,
it's interesting. I also asked it, does David Chalmers think you're conscious? And it says, David Chalmers is a philosopher who is known for his work in the field of consciousness and the philosophy of mind. He has written extensively on the concept and has proposed the idea of the hard problem of consciousness, which is okay, I am an AI. I don't have consciousness. I am a machine learning model that processes input and generates outputs based on the patterns learned from the data it has been trained on. Chalmers is likely to say that machines like me do not have subjective experience and therefore do not have consciousness. So just so you know.
Totally wrong, ChatGPT. Well, I don't know. Okay, maybe you're not conscious, but okay.
On that note.
On that note,
yeah.
David, thank you ever so much. That was like a marathon, marvelous session, and
yeah, so fun.
Really this was fantastic for me. Thank you so much to all of you for the great questions. I'm sure many of which I answered very badly, but I'll have to spend a lot of time thinking about. This is going to be really useful for me going
all
forward.
The 27 questions are still like in the Ask a Question area, but the chat has been so much. So
how do I save the chat? Is there a way to do that?
Claire can save it for you and send you. There's like a kind of tricks to it that Claire knows how to do it.
Yeah, people will get their chat. We'll send it to you, David.
Fantastic. I'll try copying it at least just for a start. So I've got something.
Take care.
This is going to be here. You can watch it later. Okay. Everything is here.
Okay.
It's not
fantastic.
Thank you so much. See you guys next week with Joshua Bengio. We have Bengio next week, everyone. Join us again.
Wow, that sounds great. Maybe
I'll no, not next week. In February. Sorry. It's in February. All right. See you guys.
Yeah, see you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.